Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I tossed the 7 of clubs onto the 6 of spades and scratched at my 3-day beard. The kerosene lamp hissed quietly on the wooden table, casting long shadows across the small hunting cabin. Outside, November winds whistled through the Michigan pines. I'd driven up from Escanaba that afternoon, arriving just before sunset at my little slice of wilderness in Delta County. The cabin wasn't much. 1 room with a small kitchen area, a cot against the wall, and a potbelly wood stove that now crackled with burning logs. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. Perfect for hunting season. I'd been coming to this same spot for nearly 15 years, ever since Uncle Ray left it to me in his will. I checked my watch, 10:52 p.m. I'd need to be in my blind before dawn tomorrow. The 8-point buck I'd spotted 2 weeks ago during scouting might still be in the area. I shuffled the cards again, the familiar motion soothing after the long drive. Whack! I jerked upright. Something had hit the window behind me, not just a twig or leaf, but a solid impact that rattled the glass in its frame. I turned, peering into the darkness beyond the window. Nothing but blackness stared back at me, my own reflection ghostly in the glass. "Damn wind," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But it hadn't sounded like wind. I returned to my cards, laying out another row. The woods were always noisy at night, branches rubbing together, animals moving about, nothing to worry about. I'd hunted these woods long enough to know all its sounds. Whack! This time, louder, more forceful. I stood up, knocking over the chair behind me. That was no wind. That was something solid hitting the window. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and clicked it on, shining the beam through the glass. The yard outside was empty, just dirt, fallen leaves, and beyond that, darkness. The nearest trees stood a good 30, maybe 40 feet away. Nothing that could have struck the window unless it had been thrown. I pressed my face closer to the glass, angling the flashlight to see along the sides of the cabin. Nothing moved in the beam's glow. I waited, listening. The wind sighed through the trees. An owl hooted somewhere far off. My hands weren't steady as I pulled the drapes closed, thick canvas curtains that Uncle Ray's wife had made years ago. I reached for my Remington, checked that it was loaded, and placed it on the table beside me. Just a precaution. Probably just some kids messing around, though how they'd gotten past the locked gate a half-mile back was beyond me. I tried to focus on my solitaire game, but kept glancing at the covered window. Minutes ticked by. The wood stove popped as a log split. I jumped at the sound, then laughed nervously at myself. Whack, whack, whack! The window shook violently. Before I could react, a scraping sound dragged down the side of the cabin, like claws or fingernails raking across the wooden exterior. The noise continued around toward the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight, both hands shaking now. That wasn't kids, that wasn't the wind. Something was out there, circling the cabin. The doorknob rattled, not turned, rattled, as if something was testing it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice higher than normal. "I've got a loaded rifle in here." Silence followed. I waited, the rifle aimed at the door, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The scraping started again, moving away from the door and around the other side of the cabin. I had to see what was out there, had to know. I moved to the door, unlocked it, and stepped onto the small porch, rifle at the ready. The cold air hit me instantly. My breath plumed in front of my face as I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing. "I know you're out there!" I yelled into the darkness. "Show yourself!" No response except the wind. I stepped off the porch, moving carefully around the perimeter of the cabin. The beam of light bounced over tree trunks, fallen logs, patches of leaves. Nothing unusual. I reached the window that had been struck. No damage visible, no signs of what had hit it. I completed my circuit of the cabin, finding nothing. Standing in the yard, I spun slowly, shining the light into the surrounding forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, revealing nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it, maybe the isolation was getting to me. Then I smelled it, a powerful odor like wet dog and rotten meat mixed together. It hadn't been there seconds ago, but now it filled my nostrils, making me gag. I swung the flashlight wildly, searching for the source. A twig snapped in the darkness, well beyond my light's reach. Then another, closer this time. Something was moving toward me. I backed toward the cabin door, rifle raised. "I'll shoot," I warned, trying to sound tough despite the fear choking me. A low grunt answered me. Not human, not any animal I'd ever heard. My flashlight beam caught movement between two distant trees, something large shifting in the darkness. I couldn't make out details, just a massive shadow retreating deeper into the woods. I didn't wait to see more. I ran inside, slammed the door, and locked it. Heart racing, I leaned against the wall, rifle clutched to my chest. The kerosene lamp still burned on the table, cards scattered across its surface. Minutes passed. I listened for any sound outside, but heard nothing except the wind and my own ragged breathing. I wasn't staying the night. Whatever was out there might return. I had to leave. I grabbed my duffel bag and stuffed my clothes inside, not bothering to fold anything. My hands still trembled as I gathered my hunting gear. I left the cards where they were, extinguished the lamp, and made sure the wood stove was safe to leave unattended. With rifle in one hand and flashlight in the other, I stepped outside again. The smell was gone now. The clearing seemed empty. I rushed to my truck, threw everything in the back, and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try, and I flipped on the headlights. Nothing appeared in their beams. I backed up, spun the truck around, and headed down the dirt road that led to the main gate. Every few seconds, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lumbering after me. The gate appeared in my headlights, chain still locked through it just as I'd left it earlier that day. I had one of only 3 keys. The other 2 belonged to the property owner and the forest ranger. I unlocked it, drove through, then got out to lock it again behind me. As I turned the key in the padlock, I heard it. A long, trumpeting call from somewhere deep in the forest. Not an animal sound I recognized, almost like an elephant, but with a guttural quality that raised the hair on my arms. It echoed through the trees, fading slowly. I practically dove back into my truck and sped away, gravel spitting from beneath my tires. The digital clock on my dashboard read 12:17 a.m. As I drove through the night toward Escanaba, my mind raced. This wasn't the first strange thing I'd experienced in these woods. Just last month, on October 12th, I'd been in my hunting blind at dawn when I heard the same trumpeting sound, once about 50 yards behind me, then again farther away. I'd dismissed it then, telling myself it was just some hunter playing a prank. But now, I wasn't so sure. I drove straight to Billy's Diner on the outskirts of town, the only place open all night. The fluorescent lights and smell of coffee were comforting after the darkness of the forest. I slid into a booth and ordered a cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Lucas," said Donna, the overnight waitress who'd known me since high school. "Just tired," I lied, not wanting to sound crazy. While sipping my coffee, I overheard 2 men in the next booth talking about hunting. One mentioned a buddy who'd seen something strange near Fuller Creek, about 5 miles from my cabin. "He swears it was 8 feet tall, walking on 2 legs, the man said. "Covered in dark hair, says it moved faster than any man could." I nearly spilled my coffee. "When was this?" I interrupted, not caring about being rude. The man looked surprised. "Mid-October, I think. Why?" "Just curious," I said, but my mind was racing. Mid-October, right before my hunting blind incident, right before tonight. I paid for my coffee and left. In my truck I sat for a long time, staring at nothing. I'd always scoffed at Bigfoot stories, called them nonsense, the product of overactive imaginations and too much whiskey around campfires. Now, I wasn't so certain. The next morning, I called Frank Hodges, the local conservation officer. I'd known Frank for years. He wasn't the type to dismiss things outright. "Frank, something happened up at my cabin last night," I told him, then described the events in detail. He was quiet for a moment. "Might have been a bear," he suggested, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Bears don't throw things at windows, Frank. They don't make elephant sounds." "No," he agreed, "they don't." Frank told me something I hadn't known. There had been 3 reports of strange sightings in Delta County over the past month, all describing a large bipedal creature. One came from a logger, one from a fisherman, and one from a family camping near Fuller Creek. "I'm not saying it's Bigfoot," Frank said carefully, "but I'm not saying it isn't either. These woods hold secrets, Lucas." I never returned to that cabin. I sold it the following spring to a couple from Wisconsin who wanted a summer getaway. I didn't tell them about that night. Maybe I should have. Sometimes, when I wake in the dark hours of early morning, I hear that sound again, that trumpeting call echoing through my memory. I lie awake, wondering what was outside my cabin window that November night in 1982, what circled my cabin, what left me with a story I rarely tell because most people wouldn't believe it. But I know what I heard, I know what I smelled, and sometimes knowledge is the heaviest burden a man can carry. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in Delta County. Some places are better left to their secrets, and some visitors are better left unmet. The men at the diner still talk about sightings sometimes. I just listen and sip my coffee. They wouldn't understand that my silence isn't disbelief. It's respect. Respect for something ancient that moves through the Michigan forests, something that doesn't want to be found. And on cold November nights when the wind blows hard, I keep my curtains drawn tight and I never ever look outside when I hear something tapping at my window. Story 2. I still remember the chill that ran through me that October evening in 1983. The Michigan air had turned crisp, and the maple trees outside my small farmhouse in Ionia County blazed with autumn colors. I'd just finished putting away the dinner dishes and decided to treat myself to a hot bath to ease the ache in my back from a long day of work. My name is Rebecca Mitchell. I was 32 then, living alone in the house my parents had left me when they moved to Florida. The property sat on 3 acres, backed up against the dense woods that stretched for miles toward the flat river. I ran the bath water, adding a capful of lavender bubble bath my sister had given me for my birthday. Steam fogged the mirror as I unbuttoned my flannel shirt. I had just slipped it off my shoulders when I felt something, a presence. It wasn't a sound that alerted me, but a strange pressure in the air, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. I turned toward the small bathroom window. The glass was partially fogged, but through the clear portion at the top, I saw it. A face. Not human. Not animal. Something in between. Dark, deep-set eyes stared at me through the window, a window that stood a good 6 feet off the ground outside. The creature's head and massive shoulders completely filled the frame. Matted hair or fur clung to its face, dark brown, almost black in the dim light. Its nose was broad and flat, and its jaw protruded slightly, giving it a primitive appearance. I froze. My throat closed up. The thing didn't move. It just stared, its eyes reflecting intelligence, curiosity. That was what terrified me most. Not the size, not the strangeness, but the unmistakable awareness in those eyes. 5 seconds passed. 10. I couldn't breathe. Then my paralysis broke, and I grabbed my shirt, clutching it to my chest. I screamed. The face disappeared instantly. I ran to my bedroom, hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. Sheriff Dawson arrived 20 minutes later with Deputy Lee. They searched the property with flashlights, finding nothing but a patch of disturbed earth beneath the bathroom window and some broken branches at the forest edge. "Could have been a bear," Sheriff Dawson suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew bears don't stand 6 feet tall and peer into windows with human-like interest. "Rebecca, you sure it wasn't some teenager playing a prank?" Deputy Lee asked. I shook my head. No teenager has a head that size or eyes like that. They filed a report and promised to increase patrols around my property, but we all knew whatever I'd seen wouldn't be caught by occasional drive-bys. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept the lights on and a kitchen knife beside my bed. After a week, the exhaustion became unbearable. I called my cousin Dale, who worked construction, and asked him to board up the bathroom window. "Board it up? That'll make the bathroom dark as a cave," he said. "I don't care. I want it gone." Dale suggested we remove the window entirely and plaster over the opening. He finished the job the next day. My bathroom became a windowless box, but I could finally bathe without feeling exposed. Neighbors talked, of course. Most people thought I'd had some kind of nervous breakdown. Others wondered if I'd seen a peeping Tom and overreacted. A few, the old-timers who'd lived in Ionia County all their lives, nodded knowingly when they heard my story. "There's things in those woods," Earl Blackwood told me at the general store one morning. "My grandpappy used to call it the hairy man. Said it's been here since before the settlers." I changed the subject. I didn't want to be known as the crazy woman who claimed to see monsters. Life eventually returned to normal. I started teaching 3rd grade at County Line Elementary. Bought a golden retriever named Rusty for company. The years passed. I dated occasionally but never married. By 1998, I had almost convinced myself that what I'd seen was just a bear, or maybe a product of an overactive imagination triggered by stress. Almost. On a warm evening in early September 1998, I took my sister's kids, Jenny, 10, and Mark, 8, for a walk. They were staying with me for the weekend, while my sister and her husband celebrated their anniversary in Grand Rapids. The kids had been cooped up all day due to rain, and when the skies finally cleared around 7 p.m., we decided to walk to Benton's Pond, about a mile from my house near the Apollo area. "Can we stay until the fireflies come out, Aunt Becky?" Jenny asked as we followed the tractor path through Millard's field. "Sure, but we need to head back before dark," I said, watching the sun sink toward the tree line. I didn't bring a flashlight. We spent an hour at the pond, skipping stones and watching a family of ducks paddle across the water. The mosquitoes drove us away before the fireflies emerged. By the time we started back, the sun had set, and dusk was deepening into night. Mark spotted the first star and made a wish. Jenny skipped ahead of us on the path, singing a Spice Girls song under her breath. The crickets chirped in the tall grass. It was peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there with them, enjoying such a simple pleasure. We were about halfway across Millard's field when the screaming started. It came from the woods to our right, maybe 100 yards away. The sound defied description. It started like a deep guttural roar that rose in pitch until it became a high, keening wail that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a bobcat or coyote. It wasn't a fox or rabbit. It wasn't any animal sound I'd ever heard in my 30 years of living next to those woods. Jenny froze mid-skip. Mark grabbed my hand. "What was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the sound came again, louder this time, closer. It had qualities of both human and animal vocalizations, like someone trying to mimic a wolf's howl, but with the vocal cords of a man. Following the scream came a series of soft hooting sounds, almost like an owl, but more rhythmic, deliberate. Then a strange chittering noise, similar to what you might hear from a chimpanzee at the zoo. "Aunt Becky," Jenny's voice quavered as she backed toward me. "It's okay," I lied, pulling both children close. "Probably just some animal. Let's head home now." We moved quickly down the path, the children's small hands gripping mine tightly. The sounds continued, seeming to parallel our movement through the field. Whatever made those noises was following us along the forest edge. "I'm scared," Mark whispered. "Don't worry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're almost to the road." Another scream tore through the twilight, this one so close that Jenny began to cry. I picked up Mark, who at 8 was really too big to carry, and told Jenny to hold onto my jacket. "Run!" I said. We did, stumbling through the darkening field toward the distant glow of streetlights. The hooting sounds kept pace with us, occasionally punctuated by that terrible scream. Just before we reached the road, I heard heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush at the field's edge. We didn't stop running until we reached my driveway. I bundled the children inside, locked the doors, and pulled all the curtains closed. Jenny and Mark were pale and quiet, their eyes wide with fear. "What was that, Aunt Becky?" Jenny finally asked as I made hot chocolate to calm their nerves. "I don't know," I said, which was both the truth and a lie. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I had my suspicions. Suspicions that connected directly to what I'd seen 15 years earlier, staring through my bathroom window. I called Sheriff Dawson, still in office after all these years, and reported what we'd heard. He sent a deputy out, but of course by then the sounds had stopped. The deputy looked at me knowingly when the children weren't listening. "This about what happened back in '83, he asked quietly. I nodded. "Folks out near Miller's Creek reported something similar last month. Sheriff thinks it's coyotes, but..." He didn't finish the sentence. After the deputy left, I sat in the living room with Jenny and Mark, watching cartoons until they fell asleep on the couch. I didn't have the heart to make them go to their bedroom. I covered them with blankets and settled into the armchair, rusty at my feet. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face at my window. I heard those inhuman screams echoing across Millard's field. 2 encounters, 15 years apart, but connected by the same sense of otherworldly strangeness. The next morning, I took the children to their favorite diner for pancakes, trying to restore some normalcy. On the way home, we passed Earl Blackwood's farm stand. I pulled over on impulse. "Wait in the car," I told Jenny and Mark. "I'm going to buy some corn." Earl was 92 now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his mind remained sharp. He smiled when he saw me. "Rebecca Mitchell, haven't seen you in an age." I selected a half-dozen ears of corn, then hesitated before asking, "Earl, do you remember telling me about the hairy man your grandfather talked about?" His smile faded. "Course I do. You saw something, didn't you? Back when you plastered over that window?" I nodded. "And last night in Millard's field, I heard something." Earl's eyes narrowed. "What did it sound like?" I described the screams, the hooting, the chittering. Earl nodded slowly. "My granddaddy called that the midnight conversation. Said they talked to each other that way." "They?" I felt a chill despite the morning sunshine. "There's more than one," Earl said. "Always has been. They stay deep in the woods mostly, but sometimes they get curious about us, especially the younger ones." "What are they, Earl?" He shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Granddaddy said they were here before us and'll be here after we're gone. Said they're smart. Smart enough to stay hidden, smart enough to know we'd hunt them if we could prove they exist." A car passed on the highway, momentarily drowning out our conversation. When it was quiet again, Earl leaned closer. "You be careful, Rebecca. They remember faces. My granddaddy said once they take an interest in someone, they don't easily forget." I paid for the corn with shaking hands and returned to my car. The children were arguing about a video game, blissfully unaware of my conversation with Earl. That was 25 years ago. I've never plastered over that bathroom window, and I've never walked through Millard's field at dusk again, but I've heard the screams occasionally, on still summer nights when the windows are open. always distant, always brief, but unmistakable. 3 years after the incident in the field, Rusty disappeared. I found his collar at the edge of the woods behind my house, nothing else. Sheriff Dawson suggested coyotes, but we both knew better. I've never talked publicly about what I saw and heard. People already think I'm eccentric, the unmarried schoolteacher who doesn't like windows and won't walk in fields at twilight. But sometimes, when a new family moves to the area, I find ways to warn them. Don't let your children play near the woods after dark. Don't investigate strange sounds. Keep your windows locked. Most dismiss my warnings as the paranoia of a small-town spinster. But occasionally someone will nod with unexpected understanding. They'll tell me about tracks they found that were too large to identify, or strange sounds they heard in the night, or a fleeting glimpse of something tall and shaggy moving between the trees at dusk. Those are the people who start plastering over their own windows. Those are the people who eventually move away. I stay because this is my home. I stay because someone needs to remember and warn others. I stay because in some strange way I've made peace with the knowledge that we are not alone here in Ionia County, that something watches and waits in the shadows between the trees, something that remembers my face, something that knows where I live. Story 3. The cold bit through my gloves as I gripped my Remington, breath clouding in the pre-dawn air. November in Michigan never apologized for its chill. The forest stood silent around me, trees black silhouettes against the barely lightening sky. 6:45 a.m., November 12th, 1983. I'd been in my position since 5:30, waiting for first light. 25 years hunting these woods had taught me patience. My name's Daniel Morgan. I've taken deer, elk, and bear across 3 states, earned respect among the hunting clubs in Sheboygan County. I know these forests better than the back of my hand. Every game trail, bedding area, and water source within 20 miles of my cabin. Or at least, I thought I did until that morning. I'd settled into my favorite spot, a natural blind formed by a fallen oak and dense brush that overlooked a clearing where deer often passed. I won't say exactly where. Those who hunt understand why we keep our best spots secret. My hunting partner, Hank Williams, no relation to the singer as he always had to tell people, had taken position about a quarter-mile east, covering another likely crossing. The first hint something was off came with the birds, or rather, the lack of them. Usually dawn brings a chorus, but that morning held only silence. No chickadees, no nuthatches, nothing. Just the occasional whisper of wind through bare branches. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig about 80 yards northwest of my position, not the startled dash of a deer or the waddle of a porcupine. This was deliberate, slow, calculated. I raised my binoculars, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible yet, but something large moved through the underbrush. The disturbance traveled along the forest edge, circling to my right. Another snap. Closer now, maybe 70 yards. I kept perfectly still, rifle ready across my lap. Whatever it wasn't following any game trail, I knew. The movement continued, a systematic sweep around my position. The pattern struck me as odd, not the direct approach of a predator, not the random path of browsing deer. Whatever was out there seemed to be looking for something, for me. For 20 minutes this continued, the entity circling, pausing, proceeding, never revealing itself, never making a mistake that would give me a clear view. Just a dark shape occasionally visible through gaps in the trees, too indistinct to identify. The wind shifted slightly, carrying my scent eastward. The movement stopped immediately. That's when I knew with absolute certainty it had been hunting me. The creature changed direction, moving with purpose now. It circled until downwind of my position, where my scent would reach it clearly. I heard 3 deliberate steps in the dry leaves. Then it happened. The scream hit me like a physical force, high-pitched, starting like a woman in agony, then morphing into something deeper, more primal. It cut through the morning air, echoing across the forest. My hands instinctively went to my ears, the rifle clattering against the blind. The sound stopped, replaced by two deep, guttural grunts that I felt in my chest more than heard. Then another scream, longer this time, modulating in pitch and volume in ways that seemed impossible for any animal I knew. I've heard bobcats scream. I've heard the death cries of wounded deer. I've heard bears roar and wolves howl. This was none of those. This had structure, intent, and most disturbingly intelligence behind it. The screaming continued for what my watch later told me was just over 2 minutes. In the moment, it felt eternal. Between the screams came those deep grunts, 3 this time, spaced evenly like words in a sentence. With shaking hands, I raised my rifle, peering through the scope toward the sound. 60 yards away, the brush moved, but the creature remained hidden. Only a dark mass visible occasionally between tree trunks. The final scream ended abruptly. I heard heavy movement retreating into a thick stand of cedars, where visibility dropped to 0. 3 rapid crashes through underbrush, then silence returned to the forest. I sat frozen, rifle still aimed, heart hammering against my ribs. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing emerged. My walkie-talkie crackled. "Dan, you there?" "Over." Hank's voice sounded strained even through the static. I fumbled for the device. "Yeah, I'm here." Did you hear that?" The usual joking tone absent from his voice. "I heard it. It was close to me. Really close." "What the hell was it?" "I don't know." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Meet me at the truck in 20. Don't take the usual trail. Go around the marsh." "Already moving. Out." I waited 5 more minutes before easing out of my blind. Every step felt like an invitation for whatever made those sounds to return. I abandoned stealth, moving quickly through the forest, rifle ready. The silence followed me. No birds, no squirrels, as if the forest itself held its breath. At the truck, Hank paced, his face pale beneath his orange hunting cap. He'd reached the meeting point before me, his blind being closer to the access road. "Jesus, Dan," he said as I approached. 25 years in these woods, and I never heard anything like that." "Me neither." I stowed my rifle in its case. My hand still shook. "What was it? Bear? Cougar?" Hank's questions had the desperate quality of a man wanting reassurance. I shook my head. "No bear makes sounds like that, and there haven't been confirmed cougars in Michigan for decades." "Wolves? Not a wolf. Not a coyote. Not anything I recognize." We drove in silence for several miles, the truck's heater gradually thawing our frozen fingers. Neither of us suggested continuing the hunt. The day was done before it began. At the diner in town, over coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, we compared notes. Hank had heard the screams, but hadn't seen any movement. From his position, the sound seemed to come from my direction. "What bothers me," I said, keeping my voice low to avoid the attention of the breakfast crowd, "was how it behaved." "How do you mean?" "It circled me, found my position, then got downwind to confirm." "That's not random animal behavior, that's hunting strategy." Hank nodded slowly, like it knew what it was doing. "Exactly, and when it screamed..." I paused, struggling to put the experience into words. "It wasn't scared or threatened. It was trying to scare me." "Well, it worked." Hank attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It could have charged, could have attacked, but it didn't. It just warned me off." "You think it was marking territory, like telling you to get lost?" I considered this. Maybe. But why not just attack? Bears do that. This thing... I trailed off, remembering the deliberate movement, the strategic positioning. This thing thought it through. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways, promising to meet up the next day to try a different hunting area. Neither of us mentioned reporting what we'd heard. In a small town like ours, stories spread fast, and neither of us wanted to be known as the guy who got scared off by strange noises in the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of wind through the eaves brought me fully awake, hand reaching for the shotgun I'd placed beside the bed. Around 3 a.m., I gave up, moved to the living room, and pulled out my collection of books on North American wildlife. Nothing matched what I'd experienced, not the vocalizations, not the behavior. The closest parallels came from accounts of gorillas or chimps, but that was impossible in northern Michigan. I even checked books on extinct species, dire wolves, short-faced bears, as if some remnant population might have survived undetected. Morning came with no answers and heavy clouds promising snow. I called Hank. "I'm going back," I told him, "to the same spot." Silence on the line, then. "You sure that's smart?" "No, but I need to know." "Then I'm coming with you." His tone brooked no argument. We met at the same access road at noon. The temperature had dropped further, and the first lazy snowflakes drifted through the trees. We carried our rifles plus my camera, a bulky Nikon I normally used for nature photography. "We stay together this time," I said as we entered the forest. Hank nodded agreement. We moved cautiously through the trees, following the same route I'd taken the day before. The forest seemed normal now. Chickadees called from the branches. A red squirrel scolded us from a pine. At my blind, we found nothing unusual. No tracks in the light dusting of snow that had accumulated overnight. No signs of disturbance. "Let's check where the sound came from," I suggested, pointing toward the stand of cedars where the creature had retreated. The cedar grove stood dense and dark, even in daylight, branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked most light. Snow hadn't penetrated here yet. The ground remained a soft carpet of rusty needles. "There," Hank pointed. "Something big came through here." He was right. A path of disturbed ground cut through the cedar grove, needles scraped aside to expose bare dirt. I knelt to examine it. "No clear prints," I said. "Ground's too soft and dry, but whatever made this was heavy." We followed the path deeper into the cedars. The trail veered northward toward a rocky outcropping that rose from the forest floor. At the base of the rocks, the path disappeared. "Could have gone up," Hank suggested, pointing to the accessible parts of the formation. "Or there could be a cave," I added, circling the rocks. "Animals often den in these formations." We found the opening on the north side, a narrow crack in the rock face, partially hidden by fallen cedar boughs, just wide enough for a large man to squeeze through, or something man-sized. I pulled back the branches, revealing the dark interior. A musky odor wafted from the opening, not the ammonia smell of a fox den or the heavy rot of a bear's lair. This smelled almost sweet, underlaid with something earthy. "We going in?" Hank asked, voice tight. I considered it only briefly. "No, not without better light and backup." "Thank God," he muttered. "I thought your common sense had completely abandoned you." I snapped several photos of the opening, then carefully replaced the branches as we'd found them. On the hike back to the truck, we discussed our options. "We should report it," Hank said. "Get the DNR out here." "And tell them what? We heard scary noises, found a hole in some rocks. They'll laugh us out of town." "So what then? Come back with searchlights and crawl into a potential predator's den?" I shook my head. "I don't know yet. But I want to set up some game cameras first. Get evidence before involving others." Hank reluctantly agreed to help me place cameras the following weekend. We drove back mostly in silence, each lost in thought. 3 days later, before we could return with the cameras, a major snowstorm hit Sheboygan County. 2 feet of snow fell in 24 hours, effectively closing the forest to any expedition. By the time roads cleared enough for travel, a week had passed. Hank and I returned to find the landscape transformed. Snow blanketed everything, smooth white drifts obliterating any signs of trails or disturbance. The cedar grove stood like a Christmas card scene, branches heavy with white. The rock formation proved difficult to find under all the snow. When we finally located it, the entrance we discovered was completely buried under a drift. "That's that, I guess," Hank said, sounding partly disappointed, partly relieved. "No way to set cameras now." I agreed, and we started the trek back. That's when we saw them, tracks in the fresh snow, leading away from the general area of the rocks. Large, distinctive prints, unlike anything I recognized. "Hank," I called, pointing. He trudged over, eyes widening as he examined the tracks. "What the hell made these?" The prints measured nearly 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Not bear tracks, which show claw marks and different proportions. Not human, though they had a vaguely humanoid shape. The stride length between prints measured over 4 feet. "Whatever was in that cave," I said, "it's still around." We followed the tracks for almost a mile. They led deeper into the forest, away from any known trails or roads, finally disappearing where the creature apparently crossed a half-frozen stream. "We need to tell someone now," Hank insisted. I nodded. Evidence in hand, or at least in photos, we could no longer justify keeping this to ourselves. But when we approached the local DNR office 2 days later, photos printed and story rehearsed, cold reality set in. The officer listened politely, examined our photos, and handed them back with a thin smile. "Likely a bear with deformed paws," he said, "or possibly a hoax. Those prints could be manufactured." "We heard it," I insisted. "The screams." "Bobcats, maybe. They sound remarkably human sometimes." He took our information, promised to look into it, and showed us out. The dismissal in his eyes said everything. "Well, that went exactly as expected," Hank said, as we walked to the truck. I had to agree. Without better evidence, we were just 2 hunters with wild stories. No one would take us seriously. Over the next month, I returned to the area several times, sometimes with Hank, sometimes alone. I set up game cameras near the rock formation and checked them weekly. Most captured nothing unusual: deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote. Until February the 2nd, 1984. One camera, positioned with view of a small clearing near the rocks, captured a single frame at 3:17 a.m. The image quality was poor, the flash reflecting off falling snow. But there, at the edge of the frame, stood a dark figure, bipedal, tall, at least 7 feet based on the surrounding trees. The flash caught 2 reflecting eyes, widely spaced on what appeared to be a large, somewhat conical head. The body shape suggested powerful shoulders tapering to a narrower waist, and it was looking directly at the camera. The next frame, taken when additional movement triggered the sensor, showed nothing. The creature had either moved out of frame or removed the camera. When I checked the site the next day, the camera was gone, torn from the tree where I'd secured it. I still have that single photograph, though I've never shown it to anyone, except Hank. We agreed that showing it would only invite ridicule or accusations of forgery. The image quality is too poor, the figure too shadowy to convince skeptics. 40 years have passed since that November morning in 1983. I still hunt, though age has slowed me down considerable. I've never again heard the screams that haunted my dreams for years afterward. But I no longer hunt alone. And I never, ever returned to that remote section of Cheboygan County forest where something intelligent enough to stalk me, smart enough to use intimidation rather than violence, and powerful enough to tear a secured camera from a tree trunk, made its presence known. Whatever the screamer of Cheboygan County was, or is, it remains there still, I believe, protecting its territory from intruders like me, managing to stay just hidden enough to remain a local legend rather than a scientific discovery. Some secrets, I've come to understand, the forest keeps for itself. Man Safkikurs, Story 4. The stench hit me like a physical force. Even now, years later, I can still recall it, that rotten primeval odor that seemed to cling to the inside of my nostrils for days afterward. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Tyler Wilson. Back in November 1983, I was 22 years old, home from college for the annual deer hunting trip with my father, Jackson. Dad was a lifelong hunter, a man who could read the woods like most people read a newspaper. He'd been taking me hunting since I was 12, and these trips were sacred to us both. We arrived at our hunting spot in Manistee County, Michigan around 4:30 a.m. The moon was just a sliver that morning, and the stars were brilliant overhead. The temperature had dropped into the high 20s overnight, creating that perfect crisp air hunters pray for, cold enough to keep you alert, but not so bitter that your fingers go numb on the trigger. "We'll split up at the old lightning-struck oak," Dad whispered as we unloaded our gear from his '79 Ford pickup. "You take the ridge blind, I'll go down by the creek bed." I nodded, checking my rifle one more time. Dad flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. We walked in silence for the first quarter mile, our boots crunching over the frozen ground. The only sounds were our breathing and the occasional snap of a twig. At the lightning-struck oak, a massive dead tree split down the middle by a storm years earlier, Dad tapped my shoulder. "Remember, don't shoot until you got a clear shot," he said. Same advice he'd given me every year since I was a kid. "I know, Dad. And stay in your blind until at least 10, even if you don't see anything." I nodded again. "Good luck." Dad's flashlight bobbed away to my right as he headed toward his blind near the creek. I watched until the light disappeared behind a ridge, then turned and made my way up the slope to my position. My blind was simple, a natural depression between two large boulders with brush built up around it to break up my silhouette. I settled in, switched off my flashlight, and waited for my eyes to adjust. It was 5:15 a.m., Legal shooting time wouldn't start until 6:30, so I had time to get situated. I leaned my rifle against one of the boulders, pulled my thermos from my backpack, and poured a cup of coffee. The steam rose in the cold air, and I took a careful sip, mindful not to make any unnecessary noise. Around 5:45, I saw Dad's flashlight flicker on again about 200 yards away. He was probably adjusting something in his blind. The light was on for maybe 30 seconds before it went out again. Then the forest fell silent again, that special kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. At 5:52, I remember checking my watch. Everything changed. First came a sudden, violent crashing sound from the direction of Dad's blind. It wasn't subtle. It was like someone had pushed over a dead tree. Then I heard my father shout, not words, just a startled sound. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The crashing continued, but it was moving now, heading directly toward me. Whatever it was, crashed through the underbrush with such force that I could hear small trees snapping. And then the smell hit me. It rolled across the forest like a wave, a stench so powerful and foul that my eyes watered instantly. It smelled like rotten meat mixed with skunk spray and something else. Something I couldn't identify, but that was somehow worse than the other odors combined. The crashing got louder. Whatever was moving through the woods was big, much bigger than a deer. A bear, maybe? But bears don't move that fast through thick brush. And in my 6 years of hunting in those woods, I'd never encountered a bear that smelled like that. The thing, whatever it was, passed no more than 30 yards in front of my position. In the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't see it clearly. Just a massive black shape moving with incredible speed, crashing through the underbrush like it wasn't even there. The noise it made as it moved was terrifying. Not just the sound of breaking branches, but a deep, rhythmic thumping that I felt in my chest. Footfalls, I realized, heavy footfalls, and that smell. God, that smell. It was so powerful that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth and nose to keep from gagging. The thing passed by my position and continued northeast, the sounds of its passage gradually fading. But the stench lingered, like it had contaminated the very air. I sat there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have called out to my father, made sure he was okay. But fear had paralyzed me. What if the thing was still nearby? What if my voice drew it back? The minutes ticked by. The eastern sky began to lighten, first to a deep blue, then to grey. I remained motionless, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate the return of whatever it was. At 6:45, with enough light now to see clearly, I finally worked up the courage to move. I picked up my rifle, chambered around, and slowly stood up. "Dad," I called, my voice sounding thin and weak in the morning air. "Dad, you okay?" No response. I climbed out of my blind and moved cautiously down the slope toward where I'd last seen Dad's flashlight. I kept my rifle at the ready, scanning the woods ahead of me. "Dad!" I called again, louder this time. Finally, I heard a response. "Over here, Tyler." I followed the sound of his voice to his blind. Dad was sitting on a fallen log, his face pale. His rifle was on the ground beside him, and his hands were shaking slightly. "You see it?" he asked as I approached. I shook my head. "Too dark, just heard it, and smelled it." Dad nodded. I was adjusting my seat when I heard something moving behind me. Thought it was a deer coming in early. Turned on my flash to look, and he trailed off, staring at the ground. "What did you see?" I pressed. "Don't know exactly. Just something big, black, standing upright." "A bear?" Dad shook his head firmly. "No bear. This was different, taller, and that smell." He looked up at me. "You smell it?" "Yeah, like something dead, but worse." "Way worse," Dad agreed. "Or whatever it was, it took off as soon as my light hit it, crashed right through a thicket of young hemlocks like they weren't even there." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing what had happened. "Want to head back to the truck?" I finally asked. Dad considered this, then shook his head. "No, we came here to hunt deer. Let's hunt deer." That was Dad all over, practical to the core. But I noticed he kept his rifle across his lap for the rest of the morning, not propped against a tree like usual, and he scanned the woods more than he watched his shooting lanes. We didn't see a single deer that day, not even tracks. It was like every animal in the forest had cleared out. Around noon, we packed up and headed back to the truck. "Let's keep this between us," Dad said, as we drove home. "No need to get the whole county worked up over what was probably just a bear." I agreed, but neither of us believed it was a bear. Not really. I didn't go back to those woods that winter. Dad went out a few more times, but never alone. Always with his buddy, Mike Slater. He never mentioned seeing anything unusual again. And eventually the memory of that morning faded, not gone, but pushed to the back of my mind. The following fall, I returned to Manistee County for small game season. I brought along my college roommate, Jimmy Rollins, who'd never been hunting before but was eager to try. We weren't after deer this time, just rabbits and maybe some grouse if we got lucky. We parked in the same spot Dad and I had used the previous year, but planned to hunt farther north, following an old logging road that ran parallel to the little Manistee River. "So what are we looking for exactly?" Jimmy asked, as we unloaded our shotguns from my truck. "Movement," I said. "Rabbits don't sit still for long. You'll see them dart between covers." We started down the logging road, walking slowly, our eyes scanning the underbrush on either side. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft and muddy in spots. About a quarter mile in, Jimmy grabbed my arm. "Holy shit, look at that," he said, pointing at the ground. In the middle of the logging road was a footprint. A huge footprint. At first, I thought someone had been walking barefoot, but as I looked closer, I realized this was much bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. It was easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions at the front. That's not a bear track, Jimmy said, kneeling down for a closer look. No, I agreed. Bears have 5 toes, but they're arranged differently, and they don't have an arch like this. The footprint had a distinct arch, just like a human foot. But it was the size that was impossible. My own boot was a size 12, and this print dwarfed it. Let's see if there are more, I said, scanning the muddy road ahead. There were. A series of tracks, each one showing the same massive foot, crossed the logging road at an angle, heading toward the river. The stride length between prints was enormous, at least 6 feet apart. Whatever had made these tracks wasn't just big-footed, it was tall. Should we follow them? Jimmy asked, his voice pitched higher than normal. I hesitated. The memory of that stench from the previous year suddenly came flooding back. But curiosity won out. Yeah, let's see where they go, but keep your shotgun ready. We followed the tracks to the edge of the little Manistee River. The far bank was steep and rocky, rising about 30 feet above the water. The tracks disappeared at the river's edge. Must have crossed, Jimmy said. I nodded, scanning the far bank. That's when I noticed something odd about a cluster of boulders near the top of the opposite bank. One of them seemed off. It was darker than the others, and there was something not quite right about its shape. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The boulder moved. Jimmy saw it too. What the... he started to say, but I clamped a hand over his mouth. The dark shape on the far bank shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a head turning in our direction. Then, with surprising speed for something so large, the figure stood up and moved away from the edge, disappearing into the tree line. "Did you see that?" Jimmy whispered, his face pale. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. What I'd seen was impossible. A massive, dark figure, at least 7 feet tall, moving on 2 legs with an oddly fluid grace. "Was that a bear?" Jimmy asked, his voice shaking slightly. "No," I said firmly. "Bears don't stand like that, and they don't move like that." "Then what the hell was it?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I've heard stories." Back at the truck, I told Jimmy about the incident with my father the previous year, the crashing through the woods, the unbearable stench, the feeling of being watched by something large and unknown. "The locals call it the Manistee Stinker," I explained as we drove back toward town. "Most people think it's just an old hunter's tale, something to scare the tourists, but there've been sightings going back decades." "Sightings of what?" Jimmy asked. "Something big, something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. The fly fishermen who use the river talk about seeing tall black figures watching them from the shore, always at a distance, always moving away if spotted." "Like Bigfoot?" Jimmy suggested, half joking. I shrugged. "Maybe, but nobody mentions hair or fur. Just a black figure. And that smell. God, that smell." We drove in silence for a while, both lost in our thoughts. "What do we do now?" Jimmy finally asked. "Nothing," I said. "We tell no one. People already think outsiders are crazy. If we start talking about giant footprints and mysterious creatures, we'll never live it down." Jimmy agreed, and we stuck to our pact. But over the next few years, I quietly collected stories from locals, old-timers who'd had their own encounters in the forests of Manistee County. Most were reluctant to talk at first, afraid of being labeled as crazy. But once they realized I wasn't there to mock them, the stories came pouring out. Old Pete Granum had been hunting near the Little Manistee in '72 when he came across a series of massive, human-like footprints in the snow. Jack and Susan Ogilvy had been camping at Miller's Point in '79 when something large circled their tent all night, breathing heavily and occasionally emitting a low, guttural sound that was like nothing on this earth, according to Susan. And then there was Bill Hatcher, who'd been fly fishing on the river in '67 when he spotted what he described as a man-shaped shadow, but too damn big to be a man, watching him from a bluff overlooking the river. When Bill called out, the figure disappeared into the trees, but what stuck with Bill wasn't the sighting itself, it was the smell that lingered afterward. Like something dug up a corpse and wore it as a suit, was how he described it. Dad passed away in '92, heart attack while chopping wood behind the house. At his funeral, his old hunting buddy Mike Slater pulled me aside. "Your dad ever tell you about what he saw in the woods that time?" Mike asked, his voice low. I nodded. "The thing by the creek? Yeah, he told me." Mike looked relieved. "Good. He made me promise never to bring it up, but I figured you should know. He saw it clearly, Tyler. Saw it standing there in his flashlight beam for a good 3 seconds before it took off." "What did he say it looked like?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Mike glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Said it was tall, real tall. 7, maybe 8 feet. Black all over, but not from fur. More like skin, he said. Dark, leathery skin. Had a face that was wrong somehow. Eyes set too far apart. No nose, just slits. And the arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. I swallowed hard. He never told me that part. "Probably trying to protect you," Mike said. He was pretty shaken up by it. "But here's the thing, Tyler. The week after that happened, 3 sheep disappeared from the Johansson farm. Just vanished. No blood, no signs of predators. Just gone." I didn't know what to say to that. Mike clapped me on the shoulder and moved away, leaving me with this new piece of the puzzle. I've been back to Manistee County many times since then. Sometimes I hunt, sometimes I just walk the woods, keeping my eyes open and my ears alert. I've never had another close encounter like that first one with Dad, but twice I've found those massive footprints. And once, on a foggy morning near the river, I caught that same terrible stench floating on the air, faint but unmistakable. Whatever lives in the forests of Manistee County is still there, still watching from the shadows. I don't know what it is or where it came from. I don't know if there's just one or many. All I know is that it's real, and it's not like anything science has officially recognized. The locals have their theories. Some say it's a surviving remnant of some prehistoric species. Others think it's something that escaped from a government facility upstate. A few of the more religious folks believe it's something demonic. Me, I don't claim to know, but I keep my rifle loaded and I never hunt those woods alone. And every November, when the leaves are down and the forest is quiet, I think about that morning in 1983 when something huge crashed through the Michigan wilderness, leaving behind nothing but massive footprints and a stench that still haunts my nightmares. Whatever the Manistee Stinker is, I hope I never get a better look at it than I already have. Story 5. I still get the chills when I think about February 11, 1984. The date is burned into my brain like a brand. I was 14 then, just a kid really, but old enough to know the difference between imagination and reality. What Michael and I found that day at the edge of Crowley Swamp wasn't imagination. The tracks were real. I've spent nearly 40 years trying to make sense of them. It started as a normal Saturday in Grand Chivas County, the kind of frigid Michigan winter day where your breath hangs in the air and your nostrils stick together when you breathe in. I woke up early, wolfed down a bowl of Cheerios, and called Michael Davis on our clunky rotary phone to plan the day. "Meet at Donovan's junkyard?" I asked. "Hell yeah," Michael replied. "Billy, Jimmy, and Todd want to come too." I groaned. The 3 younger kids from our neighborhood always wanted to tag along. Billy was 11, while Jimmy and Todd were both 10. They worshipped us older boys and followed us everywhere. "Fine," I said, "but they better not slow us down." I bundled up in my puffy blue coat, laced my snow boots tight, and headed out. The sky hung low and gray, threatening more snow on top of the 6 inches already blanketing the ground. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees, but the wind made it feel colder. We all converged at the junkyard around 10 that morning. Donovan's was our playground, a sprawling 10-acre collection of rusted cars, appliances, and miscellaneous junk that old man Donovan had accumulated over decades. He rarely came out of his small house at the front of the property, and he never seemed to mind us exploring as long as we didn't break anything or make too much noise. "Let's check the new pile by the back fence," Michael suggested, his red hair peeking out from under his knit cap. "Donovan hauled in some stuff Tuesday. Might be something cool." We trudged through the snow, weaving between the skeletal frames of stripped cars and mounds of scrap metal. The younger boys darted ahead, their excited voices carrying in the cold air. "Race you to the bulldozer," Billy shouted, and the three of them took off running. Michael rolled his eyes. "Bunch of babies." We took our time, kicking at interesting pieces of junk as we walked. The new pile turned out to be mostly household items, a broken refrigerator, some furniture, boxes of junk. Michael started digging through a cardboard box marked garage stuff. "Holy shit, Ethan," he whispered suddenly. "Look." He pulled out a magazine with a woman on the cover. Penthouse, February 1984, brand new. My heart raced as I looked at the blonde woman on the cover. "We gotta hide this," Michael said, looking over his shoulder to make sure the younger boys were still occupied with the bulldozer. "They'll tell if they see it." "Yeah," I agreed, shoving the magazine inside my coat. "Let's get out of here." We mumbled some excuse to the younger kids about checking something at the east fence and hurried away. The east side of the junkyard bordered Crowley Swamp, a dense, tangled mess of trees, deadfall, and murky water that nobody ventured into, especially in winter. But it offered privacy, and that's what we needed. "We could bury it under that big pine," I suggested, pointing to a towering tree about 50 yards from the junkyard fence. We slipped through a gap in the chain link and stood at the edge of the woods. The swamp stretched out before us, intimidating even in winter. Bare trees reached up like bony fingers, and snow covered the uneven ground. A set of railroad tracks ran parallel to the junkyard about 30 feet away, separating the open field from the deepest part of the swamp. "Look for a good spot," Michael said. "Maybe a hollow log or something." That's when it happened. That's when everything changed. "Michael," I said, my voice catching in my throat, "look down, by your right foot." He glanced down and froze. There in the snow was a footprint. A human footprint, except it wasn't human-sized. It was enormous, easily 18 inches long from heel to toe. The impression showed 5 clearly defined toes, a ball, an arch, and a heel. It was perfectly formed, just like a bare human foot, only gigantic. "What the fuck?" Michael whispered, stepping back. I knelt beside the print. It sank deep into the snow, maybe 3/4 of an inch. Our own boots barely left a mark in the crusty surface, despite us each weighing around 160 pounds. Whatever made this print was heavy, really heavy. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, looking around for signs that someone had faked it. "How would anyone fake this?" Michael replied, his voice tight with fear. "Look at it, man. It's perfect. And it's fresh. No snow in it." He was right. The edges were crisp, the details clear. This print hadn't been here long. "Maybe there are more," I said, standing up and scanning the area. We spent the next 20 minutes searching the snow-covered ground. About 10 feet away, closer to the railroad tracks, we found a second print, another right foot, identical to the first. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the February air. "Where's the left foot?" Michael asked. "There should be left prints too." But there weren't. Despite expanding our search to several hundred yards in all directions, we found no other tracks. Just 2 right footprints, perfectly formed, impossibly large, and inexplicably isolated. "It doesn't make sense," I said, returning to the first print. "Whatever made these would have to be at least 9 feet tall. Maybe more." Michael nodded, his face pale. "And look at the direction. It came out of the swamp, stepped twice, and then went back in. I looked at the tangled mess of the swamp. Fallen trees, overturned stumps, and thick underbrush made it nearly impenetrable for us. The only creatures that moved easily through Crowley Swamp were squirrels, raccoons, and other small animals. "You'd have to be tiny like a squirrel to get through that mess," I said. Or very tall," Michael finished. "Like 9 feet tall and very strong." We stood there, staring at the print. The magazine inside my jacket seemed completely unimportant now. "Should we follow it?" I asked, not really wanting to. Michael shook his head. "How? We can't get through that swamp. And anyway, do you really want to find whatever made these?" I didn't. Not really. But curiosity mixed with fear is a powerful combination. "Let's at least look a little closer," I suggested. We approached the edge of the swamp, cautiously. The underbrush was thick, the ground uneven with fallen logs and stumps. Snow had accumulated in some places, but not others, creating a patchwork of white and brown. I peered into the dense tangle, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance. "I don't see anything," Michael said. "Me neither." We stood in silence for a long moment. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the bare branches. "We should tell someone," I finally said. Michael snorted. "Who? Your dad? Mine? They'll say we made it up." He was right. Our parents weren't the understanding type. Michael's dad worked at the paper mill and came home too tired to listen to crazy stories. My dad ran the hardware store in town and had no patience for what he called foolishness. "What about Sheriff Doyle?" I suggested. "And tell him what? That we found giant footprints while hiding a porno mag? Yeah, that'll go over great." I couldn't argue with that logic. "Let's measure it at least," I said, pulling out the small tape measure I carried in my pocket. I was into model building back then and always had tools on me. The first print measured exactly 18.14 inches from heel to toe. The toes themselves were proportional to a human foot, but massive, the big toe nearly 3 inches long. "This is impossible," Michael muttered. "People don't get this big." "Maybe it's not a person," I said quietly. We looked at each other, the unspoken thought hanging between us. What else walks on 2 legs and leaves human-like footprints? "We should head back," Michael said suddenly. "The kids will wonder where we are." I nodded, suddenly eager to be away from the swamp and its disturbing mystery. We marked the location in our minds, 30 paces east of the big lightning-struck oak at the junkyard fence, and hurried back. The younger boys were still playing on the bulldozer when we returned. They hadn't even noticed our absence. "Let's go to my house," Michael suggested. "My mom made cookies yesterday." We rounded up the younger kids and headed for Michael's place. The walk took about 20 minutes, and the whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a 9-foot figure emerging from the trees. Michael's house was warm and smelled like chocolate chip cookies. His mom was at work, Saturday shift at the Grand Chivers Diner, and his dad was fishing with friends at Lake Mitchell. We had the place to ourselves. While the younger boys played Nintendo in the living room, Michael and I huddled at the kitchen table, drawing the footprints from memory and discussing what they could be. "Bigfoot?" Michael suggested, half joking. "In Michigan? In winter?" I wasn't convinced. What else could it be? I had no answer. The cookies turned to ash in my mouth as I thought about those tracks. The perfect formation, the depth, the fact that there were only 2, both right feet, with no corresponding left prints. "We need to go back tomorrow," I decided. "Take pictures." Michael nodded. "I can borrow my dad's Polaroid." We made plans to return early the next day, just the 2 of us. When it was time for everyone to head home, Michael pulled me aside at the door. "Don't tell the little kids," he said. "They'll blab." "I won't," I promised. Despite my promise to Michael, I couldn't keep it entirely to myself. At dinner that night, I tried to casually bring it up. Dad, have you ever heard of anyone finding really big footprints around here, like human footprints but huge? My father looked up from his pot roast. What are you talking about, Ethan? Just wondering if there's any local stories about giants or something. He snorted. Giants? Been reading too many comic books, son. I found some footprints today, I pressed, by Crowley Swamp. They were huge. My mother exchanged a look with my father. Probably just some melted snow patterns, Dad said dismissively, or animal tracks that got distorted in the thaw and refreeze. No, they were perfect human footprints, but 18 inches long. Dad put down his fork. Ethan, that's enough. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. It's not a joke. Michael saw them too. Michael Davis, Mom asked. That boy has an overactive imagination, always has. I could see it was useless. They had already decided I was either lying or mistaken. I dropped the subject and picked at my food, no longer hungry. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me sit up in bed, heart racing. I kept seeing those footprints in my mind, kept wondering what had made them. The next morning I woke early. Snow had fallen overnight, a good 3 inches. I knew immediately what that meant. The tracks would be covered. Still, I called Michael. We going? I asked when he answered. What's the point? He replied. Fresh snow, they'll be gone. He was right, of course. We never did take those pictures. The storm had erased all evidence, leaving us with nothing but our memories and a story no one believed. For weeks afterward, I avoided the east side of the junkyard. When spring came and the snow melted, I finally worked up the courage to go back. The ground around the swamp was soft with mud, but there were no massive footprints to be found. Whatever had left those tracks in February had not returned, or if it had been more careful. Over the years, I've researched everything I could about giant humanoid sightings. I've read about Bigfoot, Wendigo, ancient giants mentioned in obscure texts. Nothing quite matches what we saw that day. Most Bigfoot prints are different, wider, more ape-like, and none of the accounts I've found mention the strange pattern of only right feet. Michael and I drifted apart in high school. He got into sports. I focused on academics. By the time we graduated, we barely spoke. Last I heard, he moved to Detroit, got married, had kids. I wonder if he ever tells them about what we found that day. I wonder if he even remembers it the way I do. I still live in Grand Chivers County, still avoid Crowley Swamp when I can. Sometimes, on cold February days when the snow lies thick on the ground, I find myself driving past the old junkyard, slowing down to look at the swamp beyond. Donovan died years ago. The junkyard was cleaned up, the land repurposed for a small industrial park. But the swamp remains, tangled, impenetrable, secretive, and sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I swear I can see movement in there, something tall moving between the trees, something that doesn't belong in this world but exists in it nonetheless. I never found an explanation for those tracks. Never found anyone who believed me either, but I know what I saw, 2 perfect right footprints in the snow, 18 inches long, made by something that emerged from the swamp, stepped twice, and returned to whatever dark place it called home. The memory is as clear today as it was in 1984. Some things you don't forget, no matter how much time passes. Some mysteries never get solved, and some tracks never truly disappear. Story 6. I had the mud squished under my sneakers as I stepped over a fallen branch. July in Michigan meant occasional rain, and the previous night's downpour had left the 2-track path slick and soft. I was 10 years old that summer of 1984, my second year at Camp Widgewagon in Dickinson County. The thick pines surrounding us blocked most of the afternoon sun, creating dappled shadows that danced across the forest floor. "Hey, Mason! Wait up!" called Johnny from behind me. I paused, wiping sweat from my forehead, while Johnny and Pete caught up. We'd snuck away from the scheduled nature hike, preferring to explore on our own. Our counselor, Brad, was too busy flirting with the new kitchen girl to notice 3 fifth-graders slip into the woods. "We should head back soon," Pete said, swatting at a mosquito on his neck. "If we miss dinner again, they'll call our parents." "Just a little further," I insisted, pushing deeper along the muddy path. "I heard from the older kids there's an abandoned hunter's cabin down this way." That's when I saw them. I stopped so suddenly that Johnny crashed into my back. "What the?" he started, but I just pointed at the ground. There, perfectly preserved in the soft mud, was a series of footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were massive, easily twice the size of my father's work boots, and strangely wide. But what made us all fall silent was the distinct 3-toed pattern. Not 4 toes, not 5 like a normal footprint, but exactly 3 thick, widely spaced impressions at the end of each track. "Holy crap," Pete whispered, crouching down. "Look how deep they are." He was right. Whatever made these tracks was heavy. The impressions sank nearly 2 inches into the mud. I counted 7 distinct footprints crossing the path before disappearing into the thick underbrush. Johnny stepped carefully over to examine them. "It's probably the older boys," he said after a moment. "Remember last year when they made those fake Bigfoot tracks to scare the younger kids?" "Yeah," Pete agreed quickly, though his voice trembled slightly. "Just a stupid prank." I wasn't so sure. The precision of each print, the consistency of the depth, the clear definition of 3 distinct toes, it seemed too perfect. But I nodded anyway. "Sure. Probably Gary and his friends from Cabin 7. We poked at the tracks with sticks for a few more minutes, taking turns stepping next to them to compare sizes. My entire foot fit inside just one of the toe imprints. Eventually, the dinner bell rang in the distance, its tinny sound barely reaching us through the dense forest. "Race you back!" Johnny shouted, already taking off down the path. I gave one last look at the strange tracks, a shiver running up my spine despite the July heat, before chasing after my friends. Dinner that night was the usual camp fare, sloppy joes that tasted like ketchup on a bun, corn that had been overcooked to mush, and chocolate pudding cups that made the meal almost worth it. Our table was buzzing with plans. "Tonight's the night," whispered Johnny, leaning close so Counselor Brad couldn't hear from the end of the table. "Cabin 5 has been asking for it since they short-sheeted all our beds. The plan was simple. We'd wait until lights out, then sneak over to Cabin 5 with shaving cream, plastic wrap, and a bag of flour we'd stolen from the kitchen. Classic summer camp warfare. At 10 o'clock, Brad did his half-hearted bed check, more concerned with meeting up with the kitchen girl than what his cabin of 10-year-olds might be plotting. By 10:30, the cabin was quiet, except for Pete's light snoring from the bunk above me. "You ready?" Johnny whispered from across the narrow aisle. I nodded, slipping out from under my scratchy wool blanket. We were already dressed in dark clothes and had our supplies stashed under Johnny's bunk. Pete had chickened out, claiming a stomachache, so it was just the 2 of us. The night air hit my face as we quietly pushed open the cabin door. The camp was still except for the chorus of frogs and crickets. A half-moon provided just enough light to see the path between the cabins. We moved quickly, hunched over like spies in the movies I wasn't supposed to watch. Cabin 5 loomed ahead, dark and quiet. Johnny grinned at me as he pulled out the can of shaving cream, but just as we approached the steps, a flashlight beam swept across the clearing. "Night patrol!" I hissed, grabbing Johnny's arm. We bolted into the trees, not daring to look back to see which counselor had nearly caught us. We ran blindly through the underbrush, branches slapping against our arms and faces, until Johnny pulled me down behind a fallen log. "I think we lost him," Johnny panted, peering over the rotting wood. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. "Where are we?" Johnny stood up slowly. "I think—" He turned in a circle, then pointed. "That way leads back to the lake, so camp should be that direction." "Wait," I said, recognizing a large pine with a distinctive split trunk. "I know where we are." This is near that two-track where we found the weird footprints today. Johnny nodded, relief washing over his face. Oh yeah, we can follow that back to camp. We found the muddy path easily enough and started walking, our prank supplies still clutched in our hands. The forest seemed different at night, deeper, more alive with rustling sounds and distant calls that echoed through the trees. Our earlier bravado faded with each step. "Did you hear that?" Johnny suddenly asked, freezing in place. I stopped. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard something, like a branch breaking." We stood still, straining our ears. The night sounds continued, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, but nothing unusual. "Let's just keep going," I said, eager to get back to the safety of our cabin. We'd only taken a few more steps when we both heard it. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the left side of the path, not 20 feet away. It wasn't a dog's bark or a bear's warning grunt. This was deeper, with a vibration that seemed to rattle my ribs inside my chest. Johnny's eyes went wide. No words were needed. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We sprinted down the two-track, not caring about the noise we made as our sneakers slapped against the mud. Supplies dropped forgotten behind us. The growl had awakened something primal in my brain, something that recognized danger beyond what my 10-year-old mind could comprehend. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. Doubling over, hands on my knees, I gasped for breath. Johnny was pale, his freckles standing out sharply against his white face. What was that?" he finally managed. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Do you think it was following us? Those tracks from earlier?" "It was probably just a bear," I said, not believing it for a second. The sound replayed in my head, too deep, too threatening for any animal I knew. We snuck back into our cabin without getting caught. Johnny climbed into his bunk without another word, burrowing deep under his blanket despite the warm night. I lay in my bed wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin, wondering what was out there in the darkness. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound that cut through the quiet night. A scream, high-pitched and distinctly feminine, echoed from the direction of the two-track path. It wasn't hysterical or panicked like someone running from danger. It was a sustained, purposeful sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I sat up, glancing at the glow-in-the-dark hands of my watch. 2:17 a.m. The cabin remained still around me. How had no one else heard it? I slipped out of bed and padded to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. The camp was peaceful in the moonlight. No counselors rushing with flashlights, no commotion at all. Had I dreamed it? But even as I questioned myself, the scream came again. Distant, but unmistakable. I knew I should wake Brad, or at least Johnny, but some irrational part of me was afraid that speaking about it would make it more real. Instead, I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over my head like it could shield me from whatever lurked in the forest. The scream was wrong. Camp Widgewagon was almost entirely male. Just us campers, the male counselors, 3 women who worked in the kitchen, and Mrs. Hendricks, the preacher's wife who lived in the cabin by the entrance. None of them would be out in the woods at this hour, and none of them would have reason to scream like that. Sleep didn't come again that night. "You look like garbage," Pete observed at breakfast, spooning soggy cereal into his mouth. I rubbed my eyes, still burning from lack of sleep. Didn't sleep much. Johnny sat beside me, equally exhausted. We hadn't discussed what happened last night, not even when we were alone. It was like we'd made an unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. "Did you guys do the prank?" Pete asked, obvious disappointment in his voice at having missed out. Johnny shook his head. "Got caught by night patrol. Had to bail." It wasn't the truth, but it was easier than explaining what really happened. Pete seemed satisfied with the answer and started talking about the swimming test scheduled for that afternoon. After breakfast, I pulled Johnny aside behind the mess hall. Did you hear it? After we got back to the cabin? He looked at me blankly. Hear what? The scream. It sounded like a woman. Johnny's face paled slightly, but he shook his head. I didn't hear anything. I crashed as soon as I hit the pillow. I hesitated, then decided to push further. What do you think made that growl? Bear, probably, Johnny said too quickly, looking over my shoulder rather than at me. Look, Mason, let's just forget about it, okay? We're here for 2 more weeks. I don't want to spend them freaking out about every noise in the woods. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we both knew it wasn't a bear, but Brad called us for morning activities, and the moment passed. Throughout the day, I kept thinking about those tracks. 3 toes, impossibly large, deep in the mud. I needed to see them again, to prove to myself that they were real and not some elaborate prank. During free time that afternoon, I snuck away from the volleyball game and headed back toward the 2-track. The path was easier to find in daylight, and I moved quickly through the woods, both eager and afraid to reach the spot where we'd found the tracks. But when I arrived, my heart sank. The previous night had brought another heavy rain, and the path was now a small stream of running water. Any evidence of the 3-toed footprints had been washed away, leaving nothing but smooth, flowing mud. I stood there for a long while, staring at the empty ground. Part of me was relieved. Maybe it had been a prank after all, but deeper down, I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. That growl wasn't human, and neither was the scream. The sound of distant voices, other campers, snapped me back to reality. I took one last look at the muddy path before turning back toward camp, unsettled by the knowledge that whatever had left those tracks was still out there, somewhere in the woods of Dickinson County. The rest of that summer passed without incident. Johnny and I never talked about that night again, and by the time camp ended, the memory had taken on a dreamlike quality, real but distant, like something that happened to someone else. I returned to Camp Widgewagon the next summer, and the summer after that, always with one eye on the forest, always alert for any sign of 3-toed tracks or the source of that bone-chilling growl. I explored every path, questioned older campers about strange sightings, and spent more time than I should have searching through the woods during free periods. I never found anything conclusive. A few times I thought I heard something similar to that scream, but it was always distant, always explainable as an owl or a fox. Once, I found what might have been a large, unusual footprint near the lake, but it was too distorted to be certain. By my 5th and final year at Camp Widgewagon, I was 14, and had almost convinced myself that the whole experience had been nothing more than the overactive imagination of a tired 10-year-old. Almost. On the last night of my last summer, I sat on the dock, watching the stars reflect on the still lake. The younger kids were already in bed, but us older campers had been granted an extra hour of freedom. I was alone, contemplating the bittersweet feeling of knowing I'd outgrown this place. That's when I heard it again. Not the scream, but the growl. That same deep, vibrating sound that had sent Johnny and me running for our lives 4 years earlier. It came from across the lake, far enough that no one else at camp would notice, but clear enough that I recognized it instantly. My body tensed, ready to flee, but I forced myself to remain seated. I was 14 now, not 10. I stared into the darkness across the water, at the wall of pines that concealed whatever made that sound. For just a moment, so briefly, I've spent years wondering if it was real. I saw movement at the tree line. Something large shifted in the shadows, and what might have been eyes reflected the moonlight. 2 glowing points higher off the ground than any known animal in those woods should be. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest without a sound. I never returned to Camp Widgewagon after that summer. Life moved on. High school, college, jobs, relationships. Sometimes years would pass without me thinking about the 3-toed tracks or the creature that might have made them. But even now, decades later, Certain sounds will stop me cold. A particularly deep growl in a movie or a distant scream carried on the wind. In those moments, I'm 10 years old again, standing on a muddy path in Dickinson County, staring down at impossible tracks in the soft earth, feeling that instinctive knowledge that something watches from just beyond the trees. I've researched local legends, pored over cryptid sightings in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, even contacted a few cryptozoologists who specialize in unknown woodland creatures. Nothing matches exactly what Johnny and I experienced that night. Whatever left those three-toed tracks remains unidentified, uncategorized, a mystery buried in the forests of Dickinson County. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can still feel the vibration of that growl in my chest, still hear the echo of that unnatural scream cutting through the darkness. It was real, and for all I know, it's still out there. Story 7. The high-pitched chirping of crickets filled the muggy July air as I shoved my last pair of tube socks into my duffel bag. Mom stood in the doorway, a cigarette dangling from her fingers, ash threatening to fall on our worn linoleum floor. "You got your toothbrush, Ryan?" she asked, exhaling a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "Yes, Mom," I replied, zipping up the bag with a hard pull. It was July 8th, 1985. I was 12 years old and headed to Lake Ellen Camp near Crystal Falls for the first time. Our church had been sending kids there for years, but this was finally my turn. I'd heard stories about the swimming, the hiking, the pranks, all the stuff that made summer camp legendary. What I hadn't heard about were the things waiting in the woods. My name is Ryan Parker, and what happened that summer at Camp Ellen Lake has followed me for decades. The bus ride from Escanaba took nearly 2 hours, winding through the thick Michigan forests of the Upper Peninsula. I sat next to Bobby Whitaker, a skinny kid with a perpetual cowlick who'd been to the camp twice before. "The best part is capture the flag in the woods," Bobby explained, his voice cracking with excitement. "They let us play until it's almost dark." I nodded, watching the endless green blur of pine trees through the window. I'd never spent a full week away from home before. The nervousness in my stomach mixed with a building excitement. When we finally arrived, the bus crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway. Dust billowed around us as we stepped out into the afternoon heat. Lake Ellen sparkled in the distance, a wide expanse of blue water surrounded by dense forest. Wooden cabins dotted the clearing, their screen doors slamming as counselors rushed about preparing for our arrival. "Parker!" a voice called out. I turned to see Jerry Thompson, our head counselor, checking names off a clipboard. "You're in cabin 4 with Whitaker and Henderson." Tommy Henderson was already heading toward the cabin, his red hair visible even from a distance. I grabbed my duffel bag and followed, taking in the smell of pine needles and lake water that permeated everything. Cabin 4 was exactly what I'd expected. Rustic wooden walls, bunk beds with thin mattresses, and a lingering smell of must and boy sweat from previous campers. I claimed a bottom bunk near the window, while Bobby took the top. Tommy chose a bed across from us. "Heard they got a new hiking trail this year," Tommy said, his freckled face practically glowing with excitement. "Goes all the way around the back side of the lake." "Yeah, and I heard some older kids found a cave back there last year," Bobby added. I unpacked my clothes into the small wooden cubby beside my bunk, listening to them talk. The first few days of camp passed in a blur of activities: swimming in the lake, learning to shoot arrows at the archery range, making lanyards in crafts. By Wednesday, we'd settled into a comfortable routine, and that's when things started to change. It began with the footprints. After lunch on Wednesday, our cabin group went hiking with Jerry along one of the trails that wound through the woods behind the camp. The July heat pressed down through the tree canopy, making sweat trickle down my back as we trudged along. "Let's take the 2-track, Jerry suggested, pointing to a narrow dirt path that branched off from the main trail. "It'll take us past the old boathouse." The two-track was barely wide enough for a small vehicle, with tall grass growing between the tire ruts. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when Tommy suddenly stopped, pointing at the ground. "What the heck is that?" he asked. We gathered around what looked like a footprint pressed into a muddy section of the path. The rain from 2 nights before had left the ground soft, perfect for capturing tracks, but this wasn't like any footprint I'd ever seen. "That's huge," Bobby whispered, crouching down for a closer look. The print was at least 16 inches long and extraordinarily wide, with only 3 toe impressions instead of 5. The toes were splayed out, each one ending in what looked like a sharp point that had dug deep into the mud. "Someone's playing a joke," Jerry said, but his voice wavered slightly. "Probably the guys from Cabin 7. They're always trying to scare the younger kids." I wasn't convinced. The print looked too perfect, too deeply pressed into the mud to be fake. As we continued walking, we counted 7 distinct impressions, each one identical to the last, spaced about 4 feet apart. "Whatever made these would have to be really tall," I said, measuring the distance between prints with my steps. "It's just a prank," Jerry repeated, but he hurried us along faster than before. Back at camp, we told the other kids about the strange footprints. Most laughed it off, agreeing with Jerry that it was probably an elaborate hoax. By dinner time, I'd almost convinced myself they were right. Almost. That night, Bobby, Tommy and I hatched a plan to prank Cabin 5, our rivals in the camp-wide competition. We waited until lights out at 10:00 p.m., then snuck out through our cabin window after our counselor's breathing had deepened into sleep. The night air was cool against my skin as we crept across the campground, armed with toilet paper and shaving cream we'd smuggled from the bathroom. The main buildings were dark, except for a single light burning in the director's office. Crickets and frogs created a wall of sound that helped mask our footsteps. "Quick, they're all asleep," Tommy whispered as we approached Cabin 5. We worked fast, draping toilet paper over the small porch and writing "losers" in shaving cream on the screen door. Bobby stifled a giggle as we finished, and we backed away, admiring our handiwork in the dim moonlight. "Let's split up," Tommy suggested. "They'll be less likely to catch all of us that way." Bobby hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on, don't be a baby," Tommy hissed. "Ryan and I will go back on the 2-track path since it's farther from the counselor's cabin. You go straight back." Before Bobby could protest further, Tommy grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the woods. The path was barely visible in the darkness, but the pale moonlight filtering through the trees provided just enough illumination to see where we were going. We reached the 2-track and slowed to a walk, confident we'd escaped detection. "Should we check if the footprints are still there?" I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. Tommy nodded, and we moved forward carefully, our eyes adjusting to the gloom. We'd gone about 100 yards down the path when a sound froze us in place. A low, rumbling growl came from the dense woods to our left. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bear. It was deeper, more guttural, and it reverberated through my chest like bass from a speaker. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. "What was—" Tommy started to say, but the growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by the snap of breaking branches. We didn't hesitate. Pure instinct took over, and we ran. My heart pounded in my ears as my feet pounded against the dirt path. I could hear Tommy's ragged breathing beside me as we sprinted back toward the safety of the camp. Neither of us looked back. We burst into the clearing, not caring anymore if we were caught out after curfew. The growl had awakened something primal in us, a deep-rooted fear that overwhelmed any worry about breaking camp rules. Somehow we made it back to our cabin without being spotted. We climbed through the window, our hands shaking so badly we could barely pull ourselves up. Bobby was already back, sitting up in his bunk with wide eyes. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. We nodded, too winded to speak. "I heard it from here," Bobby continued, pulling his blanket tighter around his shoulders, like something angry. We crawled into our bunks without changing clothes, mud still caked on our sneakers. Jerry hadn't stirred, his snores a reassuring reminder that the normal world still existed. "It was probably a bear," Tommy whispered from his bunk, though his voice held no conviction. I didn't respond. Bears don't have three-toed footprints. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, staring at the wooden slats of Bobby's bunk above me, replaying the growl in my mind. The cabin had grown quiet, except for the various breathing patterns of my cabin mates. Outside, the night sounds had returned to normal. Crickets, an occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I must have drifted off briefly, because I jerked awake suddenly, unsure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. A scream. High-pitched and distinctly female, coming from the direction of the two-track path. I sat up, straining my ears. The camp was almost entirely male except for Mrs. Johnson, the preacher's wife, and the 3 women who worked in the kitchen. All of them stayed in the staff quarters near the main lodge, nowhere near the woods where we'd heard the growl. The scream came again, sending ice through my veins. It started as a high wail before dropping into a guttural, choked-off sound that no human throat should be able to make. I glanced around the cabin. Everyone else remained asleep, even Bobby and Tommy. Had I imagined it? I crawled to the window, pressing my face against the screen to peer into the darkness. The moon had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the camp clearing. Nothing moved between the cabins. My eyes drifted to the tree line where the two-track path entered the woods. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark shape at the edge of the forest, standing unnaturally still. Then it moved, and 2 glowing red points appeared where its eyes should be, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's eyes would, except no animal's eyes I knew glowed that particular shade of crimson. I scrambled back from the window, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I dove under my blanket, squeezing my eyes shut and trying to convince myself I'd seen a deer or maybe a counselor with a flashlight. But I knew better. Whatever stood at the edge of those woods wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal native to Michigan's forests. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of 3-toed creatures and glowing red eyes. Morning arrived with steady rainfall that drummed against the cabin roof. At breakfast, I picked at my scrambled eggs, while Bobby and Tommy devoured their food as if nothing had happened. "You guys remember last night?" I finally asked, keeping my voice low. Tommy glanced around before answering. "The growl? Yeah, probably just a bear, like I said." "Did you hear the scream later, or see anything at the tree line?" They both shook their heads. "I slept like a rock after we got back," Bobby said, shoving another forkful of eggs into his mouth. "After breakfast, I convinced them to check the footprints again, despite the rain. Jerry grudgingly agreed to accompany us, clearly humoring what he considered an overactive imagination. The two-track had turned into a muddy mess. Water filled the tire ruts, and our shoes sank ankle-deep in spots. When we reached the area where we'd seen the prints, there was nothing but smooth, watery mud. The rain had washed away all evidence. "See, nothing to worry about," Jerry said, patting my shoulder. "Now let's get back, before we're all soaked through." I nodded, but as we turned to leave, I noticed something hanging from a branch at eye level, a tuft of coarse, dark hair that wasn't there the day before. I reached for it, but Jerry called my name, urging me to hurry up. By the time I looked back, the rain had washed the hair away, or perhaps it had never been there at all. The rest of the week passed without incident. The weather cleared, allowing for more swimming and outdoor activities. By Saturday, when our parents arrived to pick us up, the footprints and growls seemed like a distant dream. Mum's station wagon pulled into the gravel lot at noon, cigarette smoke pouring from the driver's side window. "Have fun?" she asked, as I tossed my duffel into the back seat. "Yeah," I replied, turning to take one last look at the woods beyond the camp. It was interesting, I didn't tell her about the footprints or the growl or the red eyes I thought I'd seen. Some experiences belong only to those who shared them, and even Tommy and Bobby had already begun the process of rationalizing what had happened. But I knew what I'd seen and heard, and I knew I'd be back next summer and the summer after that, always drawn by the mystery of what lurked in the woods around Camp Ellen Lake. I did return every summer until I turned 16. I searched the two-track path each year, hoping to find those distinctive three-toed prints again. I never did, but sometimes when the night was especially dark and the counselors were particularly inattentive, I'd slip away to the edge of the woods and wait, listening for that deep growl or the inhuman scream. In the summer of 1988, my third year back, I found 3 deep scratches carved into the trunk of a pine tree near the two-track, too high for a bear and too deliberate to be accidental. In 1989, a younger camper claimed to have seen a tall figure with glowing eyes watching him from outside the bathroom window, but the counselors dismissed it as a nightmare. Whatever I encountered that night in July 1985 remained elusive, revealing itself only in fleeting glimpses and stories whispered between bunks after lights out. The red-eyed observer of Camp Ellen Lake became part of the camp's unofficial lore, a story told to scare new campers, most never realizing that for at least one of us, it wasn't just a story. Even now, decades later, I sometimes find myself driving past Crystal Falls when traveling through Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I always slow down near the turnoff to Lake Ellen, wondering if whatever made those three-toed prints is still there, still watching from the edge of the woods with those glowing red eyes, waiting for someone to venture down that old two-track path after dark. I never stop, though. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially those that growl from the darkness of a Michigan forest on a warm July night. Story 8. The first scream cut through the night like a razor. I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my lips, the warmth suddenly forgotten as ice ran down my spine. "What the hell was that?" Hank whispered, his weathered face caught in the orange glow of our campfire. Our hunting camp in Alcona County had been my second home every November since 1978. The familiar smell of pine, wood smoke, and the earthy dampness of Michigan's autumn forest usually brought comfort. But on that night in 1985, everything changed. 6 of us sat around the fire that evening. Me, Hank Lowry, his brother Dale, my cousin Pete Whitman, and 2 friends from our high school days, Rusty Timmons and Chuck Bradford. We'd spent the day setting up our base camp and scouting the woods for signs of deer movement. The temperature had dipped into the low 30s as night fell, and we'd gathered around the fire, trading stories and sipping whiskey-laced coffee to ward off the chill. The wail came again, a sound stuck somewhere between human agony and animal rage. This time, I pinpointed its location, just beyond the firelight, behind Dale. "Jesus Christ," Dale muttered, twisting around in his folding chair. The mournful cry transformed into a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. My mouth went dry. In 20 years of hunting these woods, I'd heard bears, wolves, coyotes, and the occasional cougar, but nothing like this. A series of yelps and howls followed, sounds that didn't match any animal I knew. They had a strange rhythm, almost deliberate, like something trying to communicate. "Lights!" Chuck hissed, fumbling at his belt for his flashlight. We all scrambled for our flashlights, the circle of firelight suddenly feeling desperately small and exposed. I clicked mine on, pointing the beam toward the sound. Nothing but trees and shadows. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Not the gentle crack of branches under a deer's hooves, but the violent snap of small trees being broken. Something was moving through the forest with tremendous force, snapping trees as it came. "Get the rifles," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. Pete was already ahead of me, moving to the gun rack we'd set up under the camp's canvas awning. He returned with our hunting rifles, passing them around with shaking hands. I chambered a round in my Remington, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. The creature, whatever it was, had stopped moving. The growling continued, lower now, almost pulsing. "Anybody see anything?" Rusty whispered, sweeping his flashlight across the tree line. No one answered. We stood in a rough circle, backs to the fire, rifles ready, scanning the darkness beyond our small clearing. The flames cast our shadows long across the ground, stretching toward the thing that waited in the darkness. Minutes ticked by. My arms grew tired from holding the rifle at the ready, but I didn't dare lower it. The growling intensified, closer now. I could hear heavy breathing, the shuffling of something massive moving among the trees. More wood splintered, and this time I caught a glimpse of movement, as a young birch tree, about 30 yards out, suddenly bent and snapped. My flashlight beam caught nothing but the falling tree. "It's circling us," Hank said, his voice barely audible. He was right. The sounds moved slowly around our perimeter, just beyond the reach of our lights. None of us spoke as we pivoted, tracking the noise as it made an entire circuit around our camp. 20 minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. Finally, the growls and cracking noises began to fade, moving deeper into the forest to the north. "Should we go after it?" Chuck asked, still pointing his rifle toward the retreating sounds. "Not a chance in hell," I replied. "Not in the dark." We maintained our watch for another hour, jumping at every distant owl hoot or raccoon chatter. Eventually we took turns sleeping, 2 men keeping watch at all times until dawn painted the sky gray through the trees. When first light came, none of us had slept more than an hour or 2. We ate a quick breakfast of instant coffee and cold sandwiches, none of us willing to wait for a proper meal before investigating. "Let's check it out," I said, shouldering my rifle. "Stay together." We moved cautiously to where we'd heard the first sounds the night before. What we found sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Several small trees, 4-inch diameter maples and birches, had been snapped clean in two about 4 feet off the ground, not cut or gnawed, but broken with tremendous force. Nearby bushes had been ripped completely out of the ground, their root systems exposed. "Bear couldn't do this," Pete muttered, running his hand along one of the broken trunks. "Not like this." Dale knelt down, examining the forest floor. "Look here," he said, pointing to a depression in the earth. "Could be a print." We gathered around. The ground was too disturbed to make out clear tracks, but there were several large impressions that might have been footprints. The forest floor was a mess of torn vegetation and displaced soil, as if something had deliberately torn up the ground. "Too big for a bear," Hank said, measuring one unclear impression against his hand. "And the pattern's wrong." We followed the trail of destruction for about 50 yards before it disappeared where the underbrush thinned out. By unspoken agreement, we returned to camp and discussed our plans for the day. "I still want to set up my blind over by the creek bend," Rusty said, checking his gear. "Best spot for bucks coming down from the ridge." Despite the night's events, we were still here to hunt deer. We decided to break into pairs and scout our usual territories. Chuck and Pete headed west, toward the marshlands. Hank and Dale took the eastern ridgeline. Rusty and I planned to check the creek that ran north-south, about a mile from camp. We carried our handheld CB radios, a recent addition to our hunting gear that year. The range wasn't great, but they worked well enough to stay in contact within a couple miles. Rusty and I separated once we reached the creek, him following it north while I checked some promising spots to the south. We agreed to meet back at the junction in 3 hours. I'd been walking for about an hour when the radio at my hip crackled to life. "Tom, you there? Over." Rusty's voice was tight, controlled in a way that immediately put me on alert. I unclipped the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up? Over. I need you to come up the North Creek path, about 1.5 miles from where we split. There's..." He paused. "There's something you need to see. Over." You okay? Over. Yeah, I'm fine. Just get here. And maybe call the others. Over. I radioed the other pairs, giving them Rusty's location. Then I moved quickly up the creek path, my rifle ready. It took me 20 minutes of fast walking to reach Rusty, who was standing on a small rise overlooking a clearing I didn't recognize. "What's going on?" I asked, scanning the area for danger. Rusty just pointed into the clearing below. "Look at that." I followed his gesture and felt my stomach drop. In the center of the clearing sat an enormous mound of freshly piled earth, at least 8 feet high and 20 feet across. It looked deliberately constructed, not like any natural formation I'd ever seen. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "Don't know, but listen." We stood in silence for a moment. Then I heard it, the same low growling from the previous night, coming from a dense thicket about 50 yards beyond the mound. "Jesus," I breathed. "It's still here." Rusty nodded grimly. I was scouting for a blind location when I found this, heard the noise, and backed off before I got a look at whatever's making it. "Smart move," I said, keeping my voice low. "The others should be here soon." We maintained our position, watching the thicket for movement. The growling continued intermittently, sometimes rising to a series of those strange, yelping calls before subsiding again. Hank and Dale arrived first, followed by Pete and Chuck 10 minutes later. They all stared at the massive dirt pile with the same disbelief I'd felt. "What's in it?" Chuck asked. "Haven't checked," Rusty replied. "Didn't want to get closer with that thing nearby." He nodded toward the source of the growling. Dale raised his binoculars, studying the mound. "There's something sticking out on the north side. Looks like antlers." I took a turn with the binoculars. He was right. The curved tines of deer antlers protruded from one side of the earthen pile. "I'm calling the DNR," I decided, pulling out the radio. Our usual channel wouldn't reach them, but I'd programmed their emergency frequency into our sets. The Department of Natural Resources responded quickly to our call. Within an hour, a green truck pulled up on the logging road about a quarter-mile from our position. We met the officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Warden Jenkins, and led him to the clearing. By then, the growling had stopped. Whatever had made the sounds had either left or gone silent at our increased numbers. "How long has this been here?" Jenkins asked, circling the mound with a practiced eye. "Wasn't here last season," Hank said. "Ground's been disturbed recently. The dirt's still fresh." Jenkins nodded, pulling on a pair of gloves. "Let's see what we've got." He approached the mound carefully, examining the exposed antlers first. Then he began to dig at various points around the pile. We helped, using sticks and our hands to uncover what lay beneath. The first deer carcass emerged within minutes, a 6-point buck, its body torn open and partially dismembered. As we continued digging, we uncovered 3 more deer in similar conditions. Mixed in with the carcasses were large clumps of wild blackberry bushes, complete with root systems, as if they'd been deliberately harvested and buried. "What kind of animal buries its kills like this?" Pete asked, stepping back from the gruesome display. Jenkins frowned, examining the wounds on one of the deer. "Bears will sometimes cover their kills with loose debris, but nothing like this. And they don't collect multiple carcasses in one place." "Could it be a person?" Chuck suggested. "Some kind of psycho?" Jenkins shook his head. "No human did this. Look at the tooth marks on the rib cage, and no person could have built this mound by hand without tools. We'd see shovel marks." He stood up, brushing dirt from his gloves. "My best guess is you've got a very large, very unusual bear that's established territory here. Maybe it's learned some strange behavior, or it's sick in some way." None of us believed him. The explanation felt inadequate against what we'd experienced, but we nodded anyway. "I'll report this and get a wildlife team out here tomorrow," Jenkins continued. "For now, I'd advise you all to hunt in different areas. Stay in groups, make noise, carry bear spray if you have it." After Jenkins left, we stood around the excavated mound in silence. "That wasn't a bear," Dale finally said. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." We returned to camp and spent the remainder of the day fortifying our site, gathering extra firewood, setting up battery-powered floodlights around the perimeter, and agreeing on a watch schedule for the night. None of us mentioned packing up and leaving, though I know we all considered it. There was a stubborn pride among us, a reluctance to be driven off by fear of the unknown. That night passed without incident. So did the next, and the one after that. We continued our hunt in pairs, taking down 2 decent bucks by the end of the week. We never returned to the clearing with the mound. The DNR sent their wildlife team as promised. They photographed everything, took samples, and ultimately attributed the scene to unusual bear activity, possibly compounded by territorial disputes between multiple large males. Their report mentioned nothing of trees snapped off 4 feet above the ground or the strange wailing calls we'd heard. We finished our hunting trip and returned home with our game and a story we couldn't fully explain. Over the years that followed, we continued our annual pilgrimages to that same hunting ground. We never again experienced anything like what happened in November 1985. Sometimes, on cold November nights, when we gather around the campfire, one of us will bring it up. We share the story again, comparing memories, trying to make sense of what we encountered. Younger hunters who've joined our group over the years listen with skeptical amusement, treating it like just another tall tale. But those of us who were there know better. We keep our rifles closer at night. We pay attention to the sounds of the forest in a way we never did before. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I swear I can still hear that mournful wail echoing from the darkness beyond the firelight. Whatever visited our camp that night has never returned. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there somewhere in the deep woods of Alcona County, watching and waiting. Some mysteries are better left unsolved in the wilderness. This is one of them. Story 9. I still wake up sometimes with the image burned into my mind. That silhouette against the night, turning to face us, rising up impossibly tall before vanishing like it was never there. But it was there. I saw it. We all did. My name's Connor Williams. Back in the summer of '86, I was 16 and living in Newbury, Michigan, the kind of small town where everyone knew your business and teenagers had to make their own fun. That July evening started like many others that summer. My buddies Alex Thompson and Jason Miller had come over, and we were bored out of our minds. "My cousin Tim left me something," Alex said with a grin, pulling a mason jar from his backpack. The amber liquid sloshed inside. Apple wine. He made it himself. Jason punched him in the arm. "No way. Your parents will kill you if they catch you with that." "So we don't get caught," Alex said simply. I glanced out the window at my parents' living room. Dad was watching the baseball game, Mom beside him folding laundry. "We can't drink it here." "I know a spot," Alex said. "Old logging trail up near Pine Stump Junction. Nobody ever goes there." 20 minutes later, I was behind the wheel of my dad's 1979 Chevy Impala, the massive boat of a car rumbling north on Highway 37. The radio played Your Love by the outfield as we left the last streetlights of Newbury behind. The night pressed in around us, thick forest on both sides of the highway. "Turn here," Alex directed, pointing to a barely visible dirt path. I slowed and turned onto the trail, branches scraping against the sides of the car. Dad would kill me if I scratched the paint. The headlights cut through darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Far enough," Alex said after we'd gone maybe a quarter-mile down the trail. "Kill the lights." I shut off the engine and headlights. The darkness was immediate and complete. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine and the chirp of crickets in the woods. Jason pulled out a flashlight, its beam weak in the encompassing night. Alex unscrewed the mason jar. "Gentlemen," he said in a fake fancy voice, "I present the finest apple wine this side of the Michigan border." We passed the jar around. The wine was sour and strong, burning my throat. I coughed, earning laughs from my friends. "Amateur," Jason teased, taking a swig without flinching. We spent the next hour passing the jar, telling stupid jokes and talking about girls from school. The wine wasn't much, just enough to give us a slight buzz, but it felt rebellious, like we were finally doing something adults did. By 10 o'clock, the jar was empty, and the mild effect had mostly worn off. I checked my watch and cursed. Shit, I told my dad I'd have the car back by 10:30. We piled back into the Impala, and I started the engine. The headlights seemed weaker than before, barely penetrating the wall of trees ahead. I carefully backed up, turned around, and headed back to the highway. Back on 37, I pushed the speedometer to 55, trying to make up time. Jason and Alex were arguing about some baseball player I didn't care about. The road stretched empty before us, a ribbon of black with white lines disappearing under the car. We'd gone maybe 5 miles when the highway curved left. I slowed to about 45, taking the bend easily. That's when our headlights swept across it. At first, I thought it was a bear, something massive and dark hunched over at the edge of the road. It was crouched over what looked like a dead deer, facing away from us, its broad back to the highway. "Holy shit," Alex said from the passenger seat, the first to spot it. As our headlights fully illuminated the scene, the thing turned. Not like a startled animal. It turned deliberately, rotating its entire upper body toward us. I felt my foot lift off the gas, the car slowing further as we approached. The creature's face caught the light. Flat. Not a snout like a bear. More like an ape, but wrong somehow. Its eyes reflected yellow-green like a cat's. Then it stood up. Our approaching headlights tracked upward as this thing unfolded itself to full height. 8 feet tall at least, maybe more. Covered in black fur from head to toe, and it wasn't on all fours like a bear would be. It stood on 2 legs. For a split second, it just stared at us. Then it moved. 2 strides. That's all it took. 2 powerful steps, and it was gone, vanishing into the thick forest beside the road. Not running away in fear, moving with purpose, with control. The 3 of us screamed, not shouts of surprise or fear, but high-pitched, uncontrolled screams. "Drive!" Jason yelled from the back seat, his voice cracking. I slammed my foot on the gas, the Impala's engine roaring as we sped past the spot where it had been. In the rearview mirror, I could see the bloody carcass of the deer still on the roadside, partially torn open. "What the fuck was that?" Alex's face was pale, his eyes wide. "What the actual fuck was that?" "A bear," I said automatically, though I knew it wasn't true. "Had to be a bear." "Bears don't stand like that," Jason said, his voice shaking. "And did you see its face? That wasn't a bear, man." We fell silent after that, the only sound the rumble of the engine and our heavy breathing. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, constantly checking the mirrors as if expecting to see that thing chasing after us. By the time we reached the outskirts of Newberry, my heart had stopped pounding, but a cold sweat covered my body. "We should tell someone," Jason said as we approached his house, the first drop-off. "Tell them what?" Alex scoffed, but I could hear the fear behind his bravado. "That we saw Bigfoot eating roadkill." "It wasn't a bear," Jason insisted. "And what were we doing out there?" I asked, pulling up to the curb outside Jason's house. "Drinking. My dad's a friend of Sheriff Barton. You want to explain to your parents why you got a ticket for underage drinking?" Jason looked away. "No." "Then we don't tell anyone," I said firmly. "Not a word." Jason nodded reluctantly and got out of the car. I watched him walk to his front door, glancing nervously over his shoulder before going inside. I dropped Alex off next. As he was about to close the door, he hesitated. "Connor, that thing. I've never seen anything like it. Me neither, I admitted. Let's just forget it, okay? He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't forget. None of us would. I drove home in silence, the radio off. Every shadow between the streetlights seemed to move. Every dark patch held the possibility of yellow-green eyes watching me. My dad was waiting up when I got home, checking his watch pointedly as I walked in. "You're late." "Sorry, Dad. Lost track of time." He grunted, taking the keys I held out. "Everything okay? You look pale." I forced a smile. "Just tired. Think I'm coming down with something." That night, I lay awake until dawn, seeing that flat, ape-like face every time I closed my eyes. I told myself it had to be a bear, a weird trick of the headlights, the dark playing tricks on us. But I knew better. The next day, I rode my bike to Alex's house. He was in the garage, tinkering with his dirt bike. "You sleep?" I asked, though I could see the answer in the dark circles under his eyes. "Not much." He glanced around to make sure we were alone. "I called Jason this morning. He didn't sleep either." "We need to get our story straight," I said, "in case anyone asks what we were doing out there." Alex nodded. "We were just driving around, bored." "Right, nothing to drink, nothing illegal." "And what we saw?" I hesitated. "We didn't see anything." "But Connor, we didn't see anything," I repeated firmly. "Because if we start talking about 8-foot-tall monsters on Highway 37, we'll be the laughing stock of Newberry by sundown." Alex looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "Fine, we didn't see anything." The three of us stuck to that story, even among ourselves. Within a week, we'd stopped talking about it entirely. If one of us brought it up, the other two would change the subject. It was easier that way, safer. Life went on. We finished high school. I went to Michigan State, then took a job in Lansing. Alex joined the Army. Jason moved to Chicago. We lost touch, the way high school friends often do. But I never forgot. Every time I drove that stretch of Highway 37 on visits home, I'd slow down at that curve, scanning the tree line. I'd read local papers looking for unusual animal sightings. I researched bears, convincing myself that what we saw could have been an unusually large black bear standing up. It wasn't until 1994, almost 8 years later, that I finally heard something that made my blood run cold. I was back in Newbury for my parents' 30th anniversary. After the party, I stopped at Darcy's bar for a beer before heading back to their house. Mike Gunderson was behind the bar, an old classmate who'd taken over the family business. We chatted about old times, catching up on the years since graduation. "Heard about Bill Peterson?" Mike asked, sliding another beer my way. "No, what about him?" "He's the game warden now. Says something's been taking down deer in the strangest way, not like wolves or coyotes. Says whatever it is breaks their necks clean and then, well, eats certain parts and leaves the rest." I felt the hair on my arms stand up. "Where's this happening?" "All over, but mostly up north of town, around Pine Stump Junction, that old logging area." I must have gone pale because Mike looked at me strangely. "You okay, Connor?" "Fine," I managed. "Just remembered something I forgot to tell my mom. I left soon after, my mind racing. That night I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Jason. His wife answered, surprised to hear from me, but put him on. "Connor, everything okay?" His voice brought back that night instantly. "Remember that night in '86, up on Highway 37? There was a long silence. "Yeah," he finally said. "I remember. You ever tell anyone about it?" "No, never." I hesitated, then asked, "You still think about it?" Another pause. "Sometimes, in dreams mostly." "I'm in Newberry now," I said. "Heard some things. Animals being killed strangely up near where we, you know." "Connor," Jason's voice was careful, measured. "Let it go, man. Whatever it was, it's not worth digging up now." "But what if—" "I gotta go. Good talking to you." He hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling more alone than I had in years. The next morning, I drove up Highway 37, past Pine Stump Junction, to that curve in the road. I pulled over onto the shoulder and got out, staring into the forest. In daylight, it looked ordinary, just trees and underbrush. But as I stood there, I felt watched. A truck slowed as it passed, the driver eyeing me suspiciously. I waved, trying to look like I had a legitimate reason to be standing on the side of a highway, staring into the woods. After the truck disappeared around the bend, I walked to the tree line. The forest floor was covered in pine needles and dead leaves. I looked for tracks, broken branches, any sign that something large moved through here regularly. There was nothing obvious to my untrained eye. As I turned to head back to my car, I noticed something caught on a branch about 7 feet up. I approached cautiously. It was a tuft of fur, black and coarse, too high for a deer, too coarse for a bear. I reached for it, then stopped, suddenly certain I didn't want to touch it. I backed away, keeping my eyes on that patch of fur until I reached my car. Then I got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I never told anyone about finding that fur. Not my parents, not my wife when I eventually married, not my own kids. What would I say? That 3 drunk teenagers saw something impossible, and 8 years later I found fur that proved it was real? No one would believe me. Years passed. Decades. My parents passed away. The house in Newbury sold to strangers. I had fewer and fewer reasons to drive up Highway 37. It wasn't until 2019, 33 years after that night, that I finally broke my silence. My wife and I were visiting friends in the Upper Peninsula, sitting around a campfire, when someone brought up weird experiences in the woods. "I saw something once," I said, surprising myself as much as everyone else. "Back in '86, near Newbury." "A ghost?" our host asked, leaning forward eagerly. "No," I said slowly. "Something else. Something real." I told them the story then, all of it. The homemade wine, the late-night drive, the thing hunched over roadkill. I described its height, the way it moved, those reflective eyes. I told them about the fur I found years later. When I finished, there was silence. Then my wife patted my hand gently. "That must have been scary," she said kindly, in the tone adults use with children describing monsters under the bed. The others nodded, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me, or they thought the alcohol had affected my perception more than I admitted, or that time had distorted the memory. I dropped the subject, forcing a laugh and saying, "Probably just a bear, right?" Later that night, as we got ready for bed in our guest room, my wife asked, "Why haven't you ever told me that story before?" I shrugged. "Would you have believed me?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. The next morning, I checked my email and found a message from a name I hadn't seen in decades. Jason Miller. The subject line read simply, "I saw it again." My hands trembled as I opened it. "Connor," it read. "Weird coincidence getting your story last night. I was camping with my grandson near Seney Wildlife Refuge last weekend. 3 a.m. Something woke me up. Movement outside the tent. I looked out and saw it crossing the clearing. Same thing, Connor. Same height, same movement, same everything. I'm not crazy. You're not crazy. It's still out there." I sat staring at the screen for a long time. Then I started typing my reply. "I believe you, Jason. I've always believed you, because I know what I saw that night. All of us saw it. The roadkill scavenger of Newbury is real, and someday someone's going to prove it." I hit send, then deleted the email and my reply from my account. Some things are better left undocumented even now, but I know what we saw on that July night in 1986, and somewhere in the forests of Upper Michigan, I know it's still there, waiting for darkness to fall, waiting for the roads to empty, waiting to feed. Story 10. I couldn't sleep that night. August in Michigan can get oppressively hot, and 1987 was no exception. My bedroom window was wide open, the curtains barely moving despite my desperate hope for a breeze. The sheets stuck to my skin as I tossed and turned, my nightgown twisted around my waist. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. when the dogs started. It was the Hendersons' German Shepherd that began first, a low, warning growl that quickly escalated into frantic barking. Then the miller's pair of hunting dogs joined in, followed by the Johnsons' mutt. One by one, each dog in the neighborhood started up, creating a wave of barking that moved from west to east behind our row of houses. My name is Catherine Wilson. I've lived in Lexington, Michigan my whole life, and I know the sounds of this place like I know my own heartbeat. This wasn't normal barking, this was fear. I sat up in bed, pushing my damp hair away from my face. My bedroom was on the second floor of our house, facing the backyard and the dense line of trees that separated our property from the empty field beyond. Something was moving out there. I could hear it. A rustling sound. Branches snapping, undergrowth being pushed aside. The barking had reached a fever pitch now, and I heard what sounded like animals fighting, snarls, yelps of pain, the sound of bodies thrashing through brush. Then silence from one of the dogs. The others kept going, their barks now higher, more panicked. I moved to my window, pushing the screen up further to lean out. The air was thick with humidity, crickets chirping in the darkness. Our yard was partially illuminated by the tall light post Dad had installed last summer. Its yellow glow made a perfect circle on the grass, leaving the edges of the yard in darkness. That's when I heard it. Branches breaking, closer now, right at the edge of our property. I squinted into the darkness where our yard met the tree line. Something was there, pushing through the undergrowth. The creature emerged from the trees with a final crack of branches. My breath caught in my throat. It stood hunched over, its back curved in a permanent stoop. Even in that position, it was around 5 feet tall. If it had straightened up, which it didn't, it might have reached 6 or even 7 feet. But height wasn't what made my skin crawl. Its shoulders were narrow, almost human-like in proportion. But its arms... God, its arms were wrong. They hung down, impossibly long, the fingers nearly brushing the ground, even with the creature in its hunched position. I gripped the windowsill, my knuckles white. The being was covered in hair, not fur like an animal, but longish hair that hung from its body. In the yellow light of the post, the hair looked whitish, almost glowing. Darker patches ran along its back, creating a mottled appearance. It took a step forward, and I saw how it moved. It walked primarily on its back legs, which bent strangely, haunched like a dog's, but it used its right hand for balance, touching the ground every few steps. The left arm stayed raised close to its body, as if injured. This gave it a rolling, uneven gait that was nothing like a human walk or an animal's run. It was something else entirely. When it stepped fully into the circle of light, I saw its face. There was no hair there. The face was bare, exposed. Wide eyes reflected the light, and I could see its nose clearly, flat against its face with 2 visible nostrils. Not a snout, not quite human. A monkey's face, I thought, but wrong somehow. It squinted in the brightness, uncomfortable with the light, and that's when I saw its forehead, slanted back dramatically, taking up almost half its face. No human has a forehead like that. No animal I've ever seen does either. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It took another step, that rolling, wrong movement, right hand touching down for balance, left arm held close. "Dad!" I finally managed to call out, my voice cracking. "Dad, there's something in the yard." I heard his bed creak, heard his heavy footsteps as he moved to his window on the other side of the house. "What is it, Kathy?" he called back, his voice thick with sleep. "I don't know. Something. Please come look." The creature's head snapped up at the sound of our voices. Its eyes, wide and alert, stared directly at my window. It knew I was watching. I heard Dad cursing, heard the sound of his gun cabinet opening. He kept a shotgun there, had since I was a kid. Said it was for protection, though I'd never seen him use it. The being in our yard moved suddenly, a quick darting motion toward the trees. Not running exactly, it was still using that rolling, three-limbed gait, but moving with purpose. "It's going back to the woods," I shouted. Dad was thundering down the stairs now. I heard the back door slam open as he rushed out onto the porch. I leaned further out my window, trying to keep sight of the creature. It had reached the edge of the yard, just at the tree line. For a second, it paused, looking back toward the house. I swear, it looked right at me again, those wide eyes reflecting the light. Then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness. Dad stood in the yard, shotgun raised, scanning the trees. His white t-shirt glowed in the light from the post, his boxer shorts flapping around his legs. "Where'd it go, Kathy?" he called up to me. "Into the trees, right there." I pointed, though I wasn't sure he could see me. He approached the spot cautiously, the gun never wavering. I watched as he examined the ground, then the lower branches of the trees. He looked up, scanning the higher branches, but the foliage was thick. If the creature had climbed, and with those long arms I bet it could climb, it would be hidden completely. "Stay inside, Kathy," he called. "I'm going to check the perimeter." I watched as Dad circled the yard, gun ready. After about 10 minutes, he came back inside. I met him in the kitchen, where he was pouring himself a glass of water, the shotgun propped against the counter. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low. I told him everything. The hunched posture, the long arms, the hairless face, the dog-like haunches, the way it moved using its right hand for balance. As I spoke, his face grew more concerned. "You sure it wasn't a bear?" he asked. I shook my head. "It wasn't a bear, Dad. It wasn't anything normal." He nodded slowly. "I found some broken branches, and there's tracks, but..." He trailed off. "But what?" "They're not like anything I've seen before. Not human, not animal. Something else." We didn't sleep the rest of that night. Dad kept the shotgun close, and I sat at the kitchen table with him until sunrise, jumping at every sound from outside. The next morning, we went out to examine the yard in daylight. The tracks were there, strange impressions in the soil, not quite footprints, not quite handprints. The right hand had left deeper marks than the feet, showing how the creature had used it for support. There were broken branches at the edge of the woods, some as high as 6 feet up. Dad called the police, but they didn't take us seriously, said it was probably a bear or maybe someone playing a prank. But I knew what I saw. It was no bear, and it was no person in a costume. Word got around town quickly. Most folks laughed it off. Some suggested I'd been dreaming or that the heat had made me imagine things. But old Mr. Jenkins from down the road came by that afternoon. "Heard you had a visitor last night," he said, sitting heavily in our kitchen chair. Dad nodded. "Kathy saw something strange." Mr. Jenkins leaned forward. 30 years ago, my daddy saw something in those same woods. Described it just like your girl did. Long arms, monkey face, walking on its back legs." "What did he do?" I asked. "Nothing to do," Mr. Jenkins replied. "It didn't bother him. He didn't bother it. But he never went into those woods alone again. That night we kept all the windows closed, despite the heat. Dad sat in a chair in the backyard, shotgun across his lap, until well past midnight. The creature didn't return. But 3 days later, Mrs. Abernathy from 2 miles east reported that something had gotten into her chicken coop. 5 chickens killed, their necks broken. No signs of them being eaten, just killed. And strange tracks around the coop, not quite human, not quite animal. A week after my sighting, Tommy Lewis, a 12-year-old who lived on the edge of town, came running home, white as a sheet. Said he'd been fishing at the creek when he heard something moving in the trees above him. looked up to see a creature watching him from the branches, long-haired with a monkey face and long, long arms. By the end of August, there had been 6 more sightings, always at night, always near the woods, always the same description: hunched posture, long arms, hairless face, dog-like haunches. The local paper ran a small story, buried on page 4. Wild animal sightings puzzle Lexington residents. They quoted a wildlife expert who suggested it might be a diseased bear, or possibly an escaped exotic pet. But I knew better. What I saw that night wasn't diseased, and it wasn't someone's pet. It moved with intelligence, with purpose. It reacted to our voices. It knew I was watching it. The sightings continued sporadically through September. Then, as the weather cooled and fall set in, they stopped. Some folks suggested the creature had moved on, following warmer weather south. Others said it had just gone deeper into the woods for winter. Dad installed motion sensor lights all around our house. He kept the shotgun loaded. For months, I couldn't sleep with my window open, even when the summer heat made my room unbearable. The next summer, as August approached, I found myself watching the tree line every evening, half expecting to see that hunched figure emerge again. But it never did, at least not in our yard. There were a few reports, though. A farmer 10 miles north found strange tracks in his cornfield. A group of teenagers camping in the woods claimed something had circled their tent all night, never making a sound except for the snap of twigs under its weight. I'm 39 now. I still live in Lexington, though not in my parents' house. I've got a place on the other side of town, far from those woods. I've told this story so many times over the years that sometimes it almost feels like something that happened to someone else. Almost. But then August comes around, hot and heavy, and I find myself closing my windows at night despite the heat. I find myself listening when the neighborhood dogs start barking, tracking the sound as it moves from house to house. And sometimes, on the hottest nights when sleep won't come, I think about those eyes staring back at me from our yard. I think about that slanted forehead, that flat nose with 2 visible nostrils. I think about those impossibly long arms and that rolling, uneven gait. I think about what it was doing in our yard that night. Was it just passing through? Was it curious about our homes, our lights? Or was it looking for something specific? I've heard all the theories over the years. Some say it was a Bigfoot, though the descriptions don't match the typical Sasquatch reports. Some suggest an escaped ape or monkey, though none were reported missing from any zoos or research facilities. The more imaginative folks in town have suggested aliens, interdimensional travelers, even government experiments gone wrong. I don't know what it was. I just know what I saw, and I know that every August, when the heat settles over Lexington like a blanket and the crickets chirp so loud you can hardly think, I find myself watching the tree line as darkness falls, waiting, listening, wondering if it's still out there, moving through the woods with that rolling gait, long arms nearly touching the ground, face turned up toward the windows where people lie awake in the summer heat. Wondering if one hot August night I'll hear the dogs start barking again, their alarm moving from west to east behind the houses, if I'll hear branches breaking at the edge of the yard, if I'll see that hunched figure step into the light once more. Story 11. September 30th, 1988. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. The cool autumn air bit at my face as I trudged through the underbrush, following my 2 buddies, Dan and Hank, up the narrow trail to our usual camping spot. We'd been coming to this ridge near Pine River for years, always a week before deer season officially opened. Kind of our tradition: set up camp, scout the area, maybe do some fishing while planning our hunting strategy. "Almost there, Mac," Dan called back to me as I adjusted the heavy pack on my shoulders. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. We reached the small clearing on the ridge around 4:30, just enough time to set up camp before darkness fell. I dropped my pack and stretched my back, looking around at the familiar sight. Pine River glinted in the distance, a silver ribbon cutting through the dense Michigan forest. "Home, sweet home," Hank said, already unrolling his tent. We worked efficiently, 3 men who'd done this together dozens of times. By dusk, our camp was set, 3 small tents in a rough triangle around a fire pit that Hank was busy filling with kindling. "Got the weather radio?" Dan asked, arranging rocks around the perimeter of our fire pit. I nodded and pulled it from my pack. Supposed to be clear tonight. Cold, though, getting down to about 35. The flick of Hank's lighter caught the dry kindling, and within minutes we had a decent fire going. The flames pushed back the growing darkness, creating a circle of warmth and light. "Anyone want a beer?" I asked, pulling a 6-pack from my cooler. The guys nodded, and I tossed cans their way. We sat on logs arranged around the fire, talking about our jobs, our families, the upcoming hunting season. Normal stuff. The forest darkened around us as night fell completely. It was about 8:30 when I first heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving along the lower side of the ridge, maybe 40 yards away. I froze mid-sentence, beer halfway to my mouth. "You guys hear that?" I whispered. Dan nodded, his body suddenly tense. Hank turned his head slowly toward the sound. The footsteps continued, methodical and steady. Whatever was making them was big, much bigger than a deer. Each step landed with purpose, without the random stops and starts you'd expect from an animal foraging through undergrowth. "Bear, maybe," Hank suggested, his voice barely audible. I shook my head. Bears make more noise. They crash through brush. This is... careful. The footsteps continued, circling toward the east side of our camp. What struck me was how precisely, whatever it was, moved through the forest. There were no sounds of branches snapping or undergrowth being disturbed, just the heavy, rhythmic impact of feet on the forest floor. Dan reached for his rifle, which was propped against a nearby tree. Hank and I did the same. The weight of the gun felt reassuring in my hands. Then it happened. A scream pierced the night, high-pitched but powerful enough that I felt it in my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard in these woods before. My blood turned to ice. "Jesus Christ," Hank whispered. Dan stood up, his knuckles white around his rifle. "Hey!" he shouted toward the darkness. "We're armed up here. This isn't funny. Show yourself." Silence followed, thick and menacing. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then another scream, even louder than before, followed immediately by a tremendous cracking sound and the unmistakable noise of a tree falling. "What the hell?" I gasped. We backed toward the fire, instinctively forming a tight circle, our rifles pointed outward. That's when something large, very large, ran past just beyond the edge of our firelight. It moved with incredible speed, taking long strides that knocked down everything in its path. Small saplings snapped, dead branches exploded under its weight. And then it was gone. The entire episode couldn't have lasted more than 15 seconds, but in that brief moment, I knew we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist in these woods. "Did you see it?" Hank's voice trembled. "Just a shape," Dan replied. "Big, though, fast." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Let's build up the fire," I suggested, already reaching for more wood. We worked silently, piling logs onto the flames until they roared up, pushing our circle of light farther into the darkness. None of us suggested packing up. The thought of stumbling through these woods in the dark, with that thing out there, was far worse than staying put. "I'm getting the handgun," Dan said, moving to his pack. He pulled out his .44 Magnum and checked the cylinder before slipping it into his belt. Hours passed. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us slept. Around midnight, as the fire dimmed slightly, I noticed it, a large shadow at the edge of our light about 15 yards out, standing still, watching. "Dan," I whispered, nudging him with my elbow. 3 o'clock. Dan turned slowly. "I see it." The figure remained motionless. I fed more wood to the fire, and as the flames grew, the shadow retreated further into the darkness. This pattern repeated throughout the night. As our fire periodically dimmed, the figure would appear, sometimes in a different location, always just beyond where our light reached effectively. Several times it took a few steps closer, causing us to raise our weapons. Each time it would retreat, only to reappear minutes later off to one side or another. By dawn, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed. As light filled the forest, the shadowy visitor disappeared completely. "Anyone else feel like they aged 10 years last night?" Hank asked, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. We ate a quick breakfast in silence. Then Dan said what we were all thinking: "Let's check where we heard that tree fall." We grabbed our rifles and headed east, roughly 40 yards from camp. It didn't take long to find it. A healthy pine, 6 or 8 inches thick, snapped clean off about 3 feet from the ground. Not cut by a saw, not chewed by a beaver. Snapped like a toothpick. "No animal did this," Dan said, running his hand along the splintered break. "It would take incredible strength." "What about a storm?" Hank suggested weakly. "Wind." I shook my head. "There wasn't any wind last night. You know that." We searched the area for tracks, but found nothing definitive, just disturbed earth and broken vegetation. Whatever had been watching us had covered its tracks well. "I think we should head back," Hank said, glancing nervously at the surrounding forest. For once, I agreed with him. We packed up quickly and hiked out, barely speaking until we reached our trucks at the trailhead. "So," Dan said as we loaded our gear, "who's coming back for opening day?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've been hunting these woods for 20 years, he replied firmly. "I'm not letting whatever it was, scare me off. Besides, I want to know what we're dealing with." Hank and I exchanged glances. As crazy as it seemed, Dan had a point. The unknown was often more frightening than the known. "1 week," I said finally. "We'll come back and see if it's still around." 7 days later, we returned to the same spot. I can't explain why exactly. Part curiosity, part stubbornness, part that strange male pride that prevents 3 grown men from admitting they're terrified. This time we came better prepared. More ammunition, brighter flashlights, a larger tent we could all share rather than being spread out. And most importantly, a battery-powered motion sensor Dan had rigged up that would sound an alarm if anything large approached our camp. The first night passed without incident, so did the second. By the third night I was beginning to think we'd imagined the whole thing. Then Dan's alarm blared at 2:17 a.m. We shot up, grabbing our weapons. The fire had burned low, and in the dim light I could make out nothing beyond our immediate surroundings. "There," Hank whispered, pointing to the northeast. I squinted into the darkness, and that's when I saw it, the same presence from a week before, standing just at the edge of visibility. We threw more wood on the fire, and as the flames grew, it retreated. "It's back," Dan said unnecessarily. And so began a pattern that would continue throughout deer season. We'd come up for 3 or 4 days at a time, and on most nights, our visitor would return. It always followed the same routine, circling our camp, occasionally making those blood-curdling screams, watching us from just beyond the firelight. One night in late October, during a particularly bright moon, we got our clearest look yet. I was on watch while Dan and Hank dozed. The motion sensor gave a soft beep, not the full alarm, just a warning that something was moving nearby. I raised my flashlight and swept it toward the sound. For a brief moment, the beam caught a dark figure crouched at the edge of our camp. It was squatting, using its long arms for balance, watching us intently. The most disturbing feature was its eyes, yellowish, reflecting my light like a cat's or deer's would, but much larger. Before I could wake the others, it vanished into the underbrush with surprising agility for something so large. I saw its eyes, I told Dan and Hank the next morning. They reflected light, like an animal's. "What do you think it is?" Hank asked, his voice low. "A bear walking on its hind legs." I shook my head. No bear moves like that. No bear watches a camp for hours. And no bear I've ever seen has eyes that color. Dan had been unusually quiet. "My grandpa used to tell stories," he said finally. "Old Chippewa tales about creatures in these forests. Things that were here before people. We didn't discuss it further. Some things are better left unspoken when you're in the woods, with only a campfire between you and the darkness." The encounters continued through November. Sometimes we'd just hear it moving around the perimeter of our camp. Other times it would scream from the darkness, that same piercing cry that seemed to paralyze us with its intensity. Occasionally we'd glimpse it, always partially hidden, always just beyond clear sight. Then, in early December, as suddenly as they'd begun, the encounters stopped. We spent a full week at the camp with no sign of our visitor, no footsteps, no screams, no shadowy figure watching from the darkness. "Maybe it migrated south for the winter," Hank suggested on our final night of the season. I could tell from his voice he was trying to make light of something that had fundamentally shaken him. "Maybe," Dan agreed, poking at the fire with a stick, "or maybe it found someone else to watch." The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the December air. That was 34 years ago now. I still go hunting in those woods with Dan and Hank every season. We're older, slower, our eyesight not what it used to be, but we've never again encountered our Forest Ridge stalker. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the fire burns low, I find myself scanning the darkness beyond our camp, half expecting to see those yellowish eyes staring back at me. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I imagine I can hear heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the undergrowth, circling our camp with the same terrible precision we witnessed back in 1988. I've researched similar encounters over the years. There are reports from all over Michigan's northern forests, hunters, hikers, and campers describing tall, hair-covered figures moving with impossible speed through dense woods. Most people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, putting a name to the unexplainable to make it less frightening, but I know better. Names don't change what we experienced. There's something out there in those woods, something intelligent enough to observe us, strong enough to snap trees, and patient enough to watch us night after night. Something that, for whatever reason, found 3 friends on a hunting trip worth studying. Dan still hunts that same ridge. He claims it's because the deer population is good there, but I know the real reason. He's waiting, hoping for one more glimpse of whatever stalked us through those cold autumn nights in 1988. As for me, I'm content with my memories, vivid as they remain. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some shadows are better left unexamined, and some things that watch from just beyond the firelight are better left alone. Story 12. The cold bit through my jacket as Mom and I rumbled down the trail on our red Honda 3-wheeler. November in Michigan meant freezing fingers and the smell of decaying leaves. I was 9 years old in 1988, and these weekend rides through Grandpa's property were usually my favorite thing. Not today, though. Today, everything changed. "Hold on tight, Emily!" Mom shouted over the engine's growl as we bounced over exposed roots. I squeezed her waist harder, my small fingers locking together around her puffy coat. The vibration of the engine traveled up my spine as we followed Dad and Uncle Rich deeper into the woods. Grandpa Reynolds owned nearly 200 acres outside Glenny, Michigan, half forest, half swampland, all of it crisscrossed with dirt trails the family had carved out over decades. The property had belonged to the Reynolds family since before I was born, and we knew every inch of it, or at least we thought we did. We rounded a bend and came to a sudden stop. Dad killed his engine and climbed off his 3-wheeler, pointing ahead to where Cousin Bart stood knee-deep in mud. his blue ATV tilted at an awkward angle in a deep rut. "Dang it, Bart! I told you to stay on the trail," Dad called out, but he was laughing. Mum switched off our engine. "Let's see what trouble Bart's gotten himself into now," she said, swinging her leg over to dismount. I stayed put, still straddling the seat. The adults gathered around Bart's stuck vehicle, their voices mixing with the distant caws of crows. The November woods were brown and grey. Most of the leaves had fallen, creating a soggy carpet on the forest floor. Without the engine noise, I noticed how quiet it was out here, miles from the nearest paved road. Just the occasional snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through bare branches, and the adults arguing about the best way to free Bart's three-wheeler. I glanced left, bored by the grown-up talk about winches and tow straps. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another tree trunk. The woods were thick with maples and oaks, their bark dark with moisture from the morning's light snow. But then it moved. Not quickly, not like a deer or a person would move. Slow, deliberate, like those nature shows about sloths that Grandpa liked to watch. The figure stood upright on two legs, tall, so tall. Later, I'd estimate 7 feet, maybe more. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that straight, that still. Its back was to me, broad shoulders hunched slightly forward. Stringy matted hair covered its entire body, not fur exactly, but something longer, darker, hanging in wet clumps. My breath caught in my throat. The thing paused, as if sensing my stare. I froze, my hands gripping the seat cushion beneath me. It didn't turn around. Instead, it continued its slow, strange movement deeper into the woods, pushing aside branches with long arms that hung almost to its knees. "Mom," I whispered, then louder, "Mom!" But she was laughing at something Uncle Rich said, their backs to me, as they pulled on a rope attached to Bart's ATV. I watched the creature disappear into the thicker brush, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to point, to scream, to make everyone look, but my arm wouldn't move. My voice was trapped. After what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds, Uncle Rich's voice broke through my terror. "There we go! Pull, Jeff, pull!" The three-wheeler lurched free with a wet sucking sound, and everyone cheered. Mom turned and walked back to our vehicle. "Ready to keep going, Em?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes still fixed on the spot where the thing had vanished. Mom climbed on and started the engine. As she revved it, I threw my arms around her waist and buried my face into her back, squeezing my eyes shut. "Whoa, you're choking me," Mom laughed, prying my fingers looser. "You okay back there?" "Can we go home?" I managed to say, my voice muffled against her coat. "We just got started, honey. Don't you want to see the beaver dam?" I shook my head against her back, the engine's vibration mixed with my shaking. "Just a short ride, then we'll head back," she promised. We rode for another hour. I never lifted my head once, keeping my face pressed into Mum's jacket the entire time. Every sound, every branch snap, every rustle made me squeeze tighter. What if it was following us? What if there were more of them? When we finally returned to Grandpa's cabin, I jumped off the three-wheeler before Mom had fully stopped and ran inside. I sat at the kitchen table while Grandma made hot chocolate, my legs swinging nervously above the floor. "Mom, I saw something in the woods," I said as she hung up her coat. "What's that, honey?" She wasn't really listening, busy helping Grandma with mugs and marshmallows. A monster, a big hairy monster. That got her attention. She turned, a half smile on her face. A monster? It was huge, taller than Dad. It had long hair all over and walked really slow. Uncle Rich snorted as he came through the door. "Sounds like you saw old man Perkins from down the road. He hasn't cut his hair since 75. Everyone laughed. Even Dad, coming in behind Rich, ruffled my hair and said, "That imagination of yours, Em, always working overtime." "I'm not making it up." My voice rose, cracking with frustration. "It was real. It was right there in the woods." "You probably saw a bear," Mom said, setting a mug of cocoa in front of me. They stand up sometimes. It wasn't a bear. All right, Dad said, his tone shifting to the one he used when he wanted to end a conversation. Drink your hot chocolate before it gets cold. I looked down at the mini marshmallows melting into brown puddles. No one believed me. Not one single person. The next day, we packed up to head home to Lakeville, about an hour south of Grandpa's property. As Dad loaded our luggage into the truck, a police car pulled into the gravel driveway. A tall officer with a thick mustache stepped out and approached my father. "Morning, sir. I'm Officer Hanson with the Glenny PD. We're checking with all the properties in the area. You folks been out here long?" "Since Friday evening," Dad replied, closing the truck's tailgate. "Something wrong?" "Got a missing 13-year-old, Melissa Cartwright. Left her house yesterday morning to ride her bike. Never came home. Parents live about 3 miles down the main road." I stood by the porch steps, listening. A missing girl. My stomach clenched. "Haven't seen anyone," Dad said, shaking his head. "But we'll keep an eye out on our way home." The officer nodded, then noticed me staring. "Hello there, little lady. You haven't seen any teenagers around, have you?" I shook my head, then blurted out, "But I saw a monster in the woods yesterday." Officer Hanson raised his eyebrows and looked at my father, who laughed nervously. "Kids," Dad said with a shrug. "Wild imaginations." "It was real," I insisted, stepping closer. "It was huge and covered in stringy hair, and it walked real slow through the trees." The officer knelt down to my level. "Is that so? Where did you see this monster?" Before I could answer, Mom called from the porch. "Emily, time to go. Get in the truck, please." I looked back at Officer Hanson, whose face had turned serious. "On the trail," I said quickly. "The one that goes past the old fallen oak. It went into the thick part where there's no path." "Emily, now, please," Mom called again, her voice sharper. The officer straightened up. "Thank you for your time," he said to Dad, then tipped his hat to me. "You take care, young lady." As we drove away, I twisted in my seat to watch Officer Hanson standing in our driveway, writing something in a small notebook. "Why'd you have to tell him that monster story?" Dad asked, eyes on the road. "Now he probably thinks we're raising a little fibber." "It's not a story," I mumbled, but neither of my parents responded. Weeks passed, then months, years. I never forgot what I saw, but I learned to stop talking about it. Every time I brought it up, the reaction was the same: eye rolls, gentle teasing, or concerned looks between my parents. When I was 12, I overheard Mom on the phone with Aunt Susan. "Remember that monster phase Emily went through? The therapist says it's normal for kids to create explanations for things they don't understand." Therapist. I never saw a therapist. Later, I figured out they'd been talking to our family doctor about my persistent delusion, so I stopped mentioning it altogether. The memory remained vivid, the slow movement, the matted hair, the impossible height. But I locked it away where only I could see it. 20 years later, I sat across from Mark in a coffee shop in downtown Glenny. We'd been dating for 8 months, and things were getting serious. Serious enough that he'd suggested we buy a house together in the area where I grew up, close to my family, but not too close. "The realtor sent over some listings," Mark said, sliding his tablet across the table. "There's a nice place about 10 minutes from your grandfather's old property." Grandpa had passed away 5 years earlier. The family still owned the land, but rarely used it anymore. The trails had grown over, the old cabin fallen into disrepair. "It's a good location," I agreed, scrolling through the photos of a modest 3-bedroom home. "Close to my work, decent commute to yours." Mark reached across the table and took my hand. "You seem hesitant. Is it too soon? We can wait if you're not ready." I shook my head. "It's not that, it's just being back in Glenny sometimes brings up old stuff." "What kind of old stuff?" I hesitated. In all our time together, I'd never told Mark about what I saw in the woods. It wasn't something I shared with anyone. The few times I'd tried in my late teens had ended badly. A boyfriend in high school had laughed in my face. A college roommate had suggested I seek psychiatric help. But Mark was different. He listened. He didn't judge. When I was 9, I saw something in the woods on my grandfather's property, something I couldn't explain. I told him everything. The three-wheeler ride, the adults distracted by Bart's stuck ATV, the tall figure in the trees. As I spoke, the memory sharpened, details I hadn't thought about in years coming into focus. The way the thing's shoulders hunched forward, the slight sway of its arms as it walked, the distinct impression that it was old, very old. When I finished, Mark was quiet for a long moment. Then he squeezed my hand. That must have been terrifying for a 9-year-old. No laughter, no dismissal. I blinked back unexpected tears. You believe me? I believe you saw something that scared you, he said carefully. Whether it was exactly what you think it was, I don't know. But I believe you experienced something real. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was more than anyone else had offered. There's more, I said. The day after I saw it, a police officer came by. A 13-year-old girl had gone missing, Melissa Cartwright, and a few months later, an elderly woman wandered away from Pine Meadows nursing home, the one that used to be at the edge of town. They never found her either. Mark frowned. You think they're connected to what you saw? I don't know. Maybe. The timing always seemed significant. He nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. Have you ever researched it? The missing people, I mean. I shook my head. I was afraid of what I might find, and honestly, I was afraid people would think I was crazy if I started digging into old missing persons cases because of a monster sighting. You're not crazy, Em? Mark's voice was firm. But maybe keep this between us for now. People around here might not understand. I nodded, grateful for his support, but also recognizing the implicit message. Don't tell others. It would be our secret. Just one more person who didn't fully believe me, but at least didn't think I needed professional help. We bought the house a month later. A cute colonial with a big yard, just far enough from the main road to feel private. As we unpacked boxes in our new living room, Mark called from the hallway. Hey, Emily, did you know there's a historical society in town? I set down the box of kitchen utensils I was carrying. No, why? Just thinking about your story? The Historical Society might have newspaper archives. Could be interesting to look up those disappearances you mentioned. My heart skipped. You want to research it? Mark shrugged. Why not? Worst case, we spend an afternoon looking through old microfilm and find nothing. Best case, maybe you get some answers. The Glennie Historical Society operated out of a converted Victorian house on Main Street. The following Saturday, we spent 3 hours scrolling through digitized newspapers from 1988 and 1989. We found the reports easily. Melissa Cartwright, age 13, disappeared on November 12, 1988, the exact day after my sighting. Her bike was found at the edge of a wooded area not far from my grandfather's property. The search lasted weeks. Dogs lost her scent at the tree line. No body was ever recovered. Martha Wilkins, 83, wandered from Pine Meadows nursing home on February 3, 1989. Security cameras showed her entering the woods behind the facility at 2:17 a.m. Search parties combed the area for days. Nothing. 2 disappearances in 3 months, Mark murmured as we drove home. That's unusual for a small town. 3, I corrected. 3? The volunteer at the Historical Society mentioned another one when I asked about Melissa Cartwright. A hunter named Jim Reeves went missing in those same woods in October 1988, right before I saw whatever I saw. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. And they never found any of them? I shook my head. Not a trace. That night I dreamed of the creature. For the first time in decades I saw its slow, deliberate movement through the trees. But in my dream, it turned. Its face was obscured by hanging hair, but I could feel it looking at me, directly at me. And in its hand something colourful dangled, a child's bracelet with plastic beads. I woke gasping, sweat soaking the sheets. "What is it?" Mark mumbled, half asleep. "Nothing," I whispered. "Just a bad dream." But it wasn't nothing. The dream felt like a memory unlocking, something I'd seen but blocked out. Had the creature been holding something that day? I couldn't be sure, but the dream left me shaken. The following week I ran into Officer Hanson, now retired Chief Hanson, at the grocery store. He didn't remember me, of course, but when I mentioned the Cartwright case, his face darkened. Nasty business, that one. Never solved. You know, we had 3 disappearances within 6 months back then, all in or near those woods east of town. Never did figure out what happened. I swallowed hard. Any theories? The old man glanced around, then lowered his voice. Between you and me, something wasn't right about those woods. Search dogs wouldn't go in after a certain point. Just sat down and whined. Good dogs too, never saw anything like it. My skin prickled. Did you ever hear any reports of unusual sightings in that area? Chief Hanson studied my face. You know something I don't miss? No, just curious. He didn't look convinced. Well, there were rumors. Always are in small towns. Some folk talked about hearing strange noises at night. Others claimed to have seen something big moving through the trees. Most people chalked it up to bears or overactive imaginations. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. Funny thing, though, he continued. I remember a little girl telling me she saw a monster in those woods, right around when Melissa went missing. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. My breath caught. What did you do about it? Wrote it down in my report. Supervisor told me to leave it out of the official file. Said we didn't need monster stories complicating a missing persons case. He sighed. Sometimes I wonder if we missed something important. As I drove home, my hands shook on the steering wheel. After all these years, someone had taken my sighting seriously, even if it was too late to matter. That night, I stood at our bedroom window, looking out at the dark trees that bordered our property to the east, the same forest that stretched all the way to my grandfather's land. The forest where Melissa Cartwright, Martha Wilkins, and Jim Reeves had vanished without a trace. The forest where I had seen something impossible when I was 9 years old. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. Whatever walked those woods in 1988 might still be out there, watching, waiting, moving with that same slow, deliberate gait through the shadows between the trees. And now I lived right on the edge of its territory. Story 13. The shotgun felt cold in my hands as another tree splintered in the darkness. Whatever was out there wasn't natural. It wasn't right, and it was getting closer. I'm going to talk to it, Bobby said, his voice steady in a way that made no sense given what we were hearing. Bobby, don't... But he was already walking away from our campfire, stepping into the Michigan darkness where that thing waited. I chambered a shell and tried to stop my hands from shaking. My name is Mason Wright. Back in spring of 1989, I was 16 years old, living in Kalamazoo County, Michigan. Most folks around there worked regular jobs, at the paper mill, the auto parts factory, or farming the flatlands to the west. My dad drove trucks, gone for days at a time hauling freight across state lines. That left me plenty of time to roam. Bobby Garner had been my friend since first grade. We weren't much for team sports or video games. We spent our free time in the woods, especially the swampy forest that stretched for miles east of town. By 16, we knew those woods better than we knew the hallways of Oak Ridge High School. That weekend in '89 was like many others. We'd packed our gear on Friday after school: tent, sleeping bags, Bobby's dad's old Coleman stove, my shotgun, and enough food for 2 nights. The shotgun was a 12-gauge Remington my grandfather had given me for my 14th birthday. In those parts, that wasn't unusual. We hunted small game, and the woods had black bears, though they usually kept their distance. We hiked about 4 miles in, following the creek that wound through the densest part of the forest. Our spot sat between 2 massive oak trees on a small rise above a bend in the stream. We'd camped there dozens of times over the years. "Perfect night," Bobby said as we finished setting up the tent. The spring air felt cool but not cold. Frogs croaked from the creek, and somewhere an owl called. "Yeah? No rain for once?" I arranged stones in a circle for our fire pit, though we'd used the same spot so many times that the ground was permanently blackened. We gathered wood, started a small fire, and cooked hot dogs on sticks. As darkness fell completely, the familiar night sounds of the forest settled around us. Crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Bobby pulled out a dog-eared paperback, some horror novel he'd been reading all week. I cleaned my shotgun, a habit my grandpa had drilled into me. Neither of us mentioned what had happened the last few times we'd been here. It was like talking about it might summon it. The digital watch on my wrist showed 11:45 p.m. when I first noticed the silence. The frogs had stopped, the crickets too. I glanced at Bobby, who had put his book down. "You hear that?" I asked. "I don't hear anything," he said. "That's the problem." We both sat completely still, listening. The fire crackled between us, but beyond that, nothing. The forest had gone dead quiet. Then I heard it. From the south, following the path of the creek, came a sound of movement. Heavy footfalls, not like a deer or even a bear. Something big was walking deliberately toward our campsite. Bobby's eyes met mine. He nodded slightly. I reached behind me, where I'd propped the shotgun against my backpack. The weight of it felt reassuring in my hands. The footsteps stopped about 30 yards away. For several seconds, there was nothing, just complete silence and the faint glow of our dying fire. Then the forest erupted. A scream tore through the night. Not human, not any animal I recognized. It started low and rose to a pitch that made my teeth hurt. Another followed, then another. Between the screams came howls that reminded me of wolves, but deeper, more guttural. Something hit a tree with tremendous force. Wood splintered. Branches snapped and fell. Whatever was out there was destroying a tree with its bare hands, or claws, or whatever it had. "Jesus," I whispered, fumbling with shotgun shells. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I loaded the weapon. Bobby stood up. His face looked eerily calm in the firelight. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "I'm going to talk to it," he said simply. "Are you crazy? Get back here!" But Bobby walked straight out of the circle of firelight. He stopped about 10 feet away, just a silhouette against the complete darkness of the forest. The screaming continued. Another tree cracked. I raised the shotgun, trying to see past Bobby into the darkness, but there was nothing visible beyond him. "Hello?" Bobby called out. "We hear you." The screaming paused briefly, then redoubled. Something crashed through undergrowth. It sounded like it was circling around, moving east of our position. "We know you're there," Bobby continued, his voice steady. "We've heard you before." I stood up now too, shotgun at the ready, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Bobby, get back here," I said, but my voice came out as a croak. The thing, whatever it was, let out another howl, this one so loud and close that I nearly dropped the gun. It couldn't have been more than 20 yards away now. "We're not afraid of you," Bobby called out. I wanted to shout that he was wrong, that I was terrified, but my mouth had gone dry. For 5 more minutes the creature continued its display. Trees splintered, brush crashed. The screams and howls came from different directions, as if it was moving rapidly around our camp, always just beyond where we could see it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Everything stopped. The silence was immediate and complete. No retreating footsteps, no crashing through the underbrush. It was as if the thing had simply ceased to exist. Slowly, the normal night sounds resumed. A cricket chirped tentatively. From the creek, a frog started up again. Bobby turned and walked back to the fire. His face was flushed, but his eyes looked bright, excited. "What the hell was that?" I managed to ask, still gripping the shotgun. Bobby sat down and poked at the fire with a stick. Same as before, the monkey beast. That was the name we'd given it after the first time we'd heard it, 3 years earlier. The initial screams had reminded us of documentaries we'd seen about primates. Not that either of us thought there were monkeys in Michigan. "It was closer this time," I said, finally lowering myself back onto my log seat. "Yeah." Bobby stared into the fire. "But it never comes all the way in, never shows itself." I remembered the first time we'd encountered it. We were 13, camping in this exact spot. We'd heard strange calls in the night, different from anything we'd ever heard in these woods before. Back then, we'd been too scared to do anything but hide in our tent until morning. The second time, a few months later, we'd heard the same sounds, but fainter, farther away. By the third encounter, Bobby had started calling out to it, like he'd done tonight. This was the first time it had responded so violently. "You know what's weird?" Bobby said after a while. "It only ever shows up when it's just the two of us." He was right. We'd camped here many times with other friends, with Bobby's older brother and his friends, with guys from school. Once we'd brought a whole group of 5 people. Nothing unusual had ever happened on those trips. But when it was just Bobby and me, the thing appeared. Not every time, but often enough. This was maybe the 8th or 9th incident over 5 years. "You think we should tell someone?" I asked, not for the first time. Bobby shook his head. "Who'd believe us? Plus, my dad would probably make me stop coming out here if he thought there was something dangerous in these woods." I nodded. My dad would do the same, if he was around enough to notice. Neither of us slept much that night. We kept the fire going until dawn, taking turns keeping watch. Nothing more happened. In the morning's light, we explored the area south of our camp, where the sounds had come from. We found broken branches and a young birch tree that had been snapped about 8 feet up. The top hung down, barely attached by a strip of bark, but the ground was too hard and leaf-covered to show footprints, and we found no hair or other signs of what had been there. "Next time, I'm bringing my tape recorder," Bobby said, examining the damaged tree. "Next time I might bring a tank," I muttered. But we did come back, many times over the next few years, sometimes with others, sometimes just the two of us. We heard the monkey beast twice more before we graduated high school in 1991. Each encounter followed the same pattern. It would approach at night, stop short of our camp, make those terrible sounds, damage trees and brush, and then vanish without a trace. Bobby tried to capture the sounds on a tape recorder during our last encounter before graduation, but the recording picked up only static when played back. We tried to take photos too, but in those days before digital cameras, our cheap disposable flash cameras showed nothing but grainy darkness beyond the firelight. After high school, things changed. I went to community college in Grand Rapids. Bobby joined the Army. Our trips to the woods became less frequent, and by 1993, we'd stopped going altogether. Years passed. I got a job at an insurance company, married a girl named Elaine from work, and moved to Lansing. Bobby served 8 years, including deployments to the first Gulf War and later Bosnia. He came back to Kalamazoo in 1999, worked construction, and eventually started his own small contracting business. We kept in touch, got together for beers when I visited my mum, who still lived in our hometown. We rarely talked about those nights in the woods. When we did, it was usually as a joke. "Remember when we thought there was a monster in the swamp?" In the summer of 2001, Bobby called me out of the blue on a Tuesday night. "Mason," he said when I answered, "you free this weekend?" "Maybe. Why?" "I want to go back to the camp spot, see if our friend is still there." I hadn't thought about the monkey beast in years, but hearing Bobby mention it sent a chill up my spine, a sense memory of those screams in the darkness. "I don't know, man," I said. "It's been a long time." "Exactly. I've got better equipment now. Digital recorder, night vision camera I bought online." "Bobby, one night, for old time's sake." I sighed. "Let me check with Elaine." That Friday, I drove back to Kalamazoo and met Bobby at his house. He looked different, broader, with a close-cropped military haircut he'd kept after discharge, and a new scar on his chin I hadn't noticed the last time I'd seen him. But his eyes still lit up with that same excitement when he showed me the gear he'd packed. "This camera can see in complete darkness," he said, holding up what looked like a camcorder with some extra attachments. "And the digital recorder captures frequencies the human ear can't even detect." "You've put some thought into this," I said. "Been planning it for years, just waiting for the technology to catch up." He grinned. "Oh, and I brought this too." He pulled out a handgun from his backpack. "Jesus, Bobby. Just in case. It's licensed and everything. I'd brought my old shotgun, more out of nostalgia than any expectation we'd need it. It felt like we were 13 again, heading into the woods to play at being explorers." The hike-in took longer than I remembered. The path was more overgrown, and neither of us was as nimble as we'd been at 16, but we found the spot between the two oaks, now even larger than before. The fire pit was still there, though grown over with weeds. "Home sweet home," Bobby said, dropping his pack. We set up camp just like old times, though our equipment was better, a lightweight modern tent instead of the army surplus canvas we'd used as kids, a compact gas stove instead of the bulky Coleman. Bobby positioned his night vision camera on a tripod facing south, toward where the sounds had always come from. He set up the digital recorder nearby. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, drinking beers from cans we'd packed in. "You really think it's still out there?" I asked. Bobby shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Midnight came and went. The forest sounds were as I remembered them. Frogs, insects, the occasional rustle of nocturnal animals, but nothing unusual. "Maybe it's moved on," I said, after checking my watch at 1:30 a.m. "Or maybe it was just some weird animal that's long dead." "Maybe," Bobby said, but he kept staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. At 2:17 a.m., I remember the time precisely because I'd just checked my watch again. The forest went silent. The familiar hush fell over everything, just as it had all those years ago. Bobby sat up straight. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, reaching for the shotgun beside me. We waited, listening. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, faintly at first, but growing louder, came the sound of something large moving through the woods from the south. Heavy footfalls, brush being pushed aside. The sounds were exactly as I remembered them, and yet hearing them as an adult was somehow more terrifying. My teenage mind could rationalize, could believe in unknown creatures. At 28, I knew better what belonged in these woods, and what didn't. This didn't. Bobby switched on his digital recorder and checked that the camera was running. His face in the firelight looked both terrified and exhilarated. The footsteps stopped, just as before, some distance from our camp. For a long moment, everything was completely still. Then a scream cut through the night, that same unearthly howl that had haunted my dreams for years after our last encounter. It was followed by another, then more, building to a cacophony of sounds that made my skin crawl. Wood splintered as something struck a tree with tremendous force. Branches crashed down. Another impact, another tree being damaged. Bobby stood up. "I'm going to talk to it." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "Not this time." But he pulled free and walked to the edge of the firelight, just as he had all those years ago. "We're back," he called into the darkness. "We came back for you." The screaming intensified. Something large moved rapidly around the perimeter of our camp, just beyond where we could see it. The camera on its tripod slowly rotated, tracking the movement. "Show yourself," Bobby shouted. "We know you're there." I raised the shotgun, pointing it into the darkness beyond Bobby. My hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been as a teenager. Whatever happened, I wasn't going to let anything get to us. For 10 minutes the creature circled and screamed. Trees cracked and splintered. Brush was flattened by something large moving through it with tremendous force. Then, just like before, it stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest. Bobby turned back toward me, his face showing disappointment. "It's gone," he said. "Just like before," I replied, lowering the shotgun slightly. That's when I saw it. Just behind Bobby, at the edge of the darkness, something moved. A shape, darker than the surrounding night, at least 7 feet tall. For a split second I saw a silhouette, broad shoulders, a head that seemed too small for its body, long arms that hung almost to the ground. "Bobby!" I shouted, raising the shotgun again. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The shape, if it had ever been there at all, had vanished. "What?" he asked, staring into the empty darkness. "What did you see?" "I don't know," I said truthfully. "Something. Maybe nothing. A shadow." Bobby rushed to check his camera and recorder. The camera had stopped recording. The battery drained despite being fully charged before we set out. The digital recorder was still running, but when Bobby played back the file, it contained nothing but static during the exact period when the creature had been present. "Damn it!" he yelled, slamming his hand against a tree. "Every time. Why can't we get proof?" We stayed awake the rest of the night, but nothing more happened. In the morning, we found more broken trees and flattened brush in a circle around our camp. But again, no footprints, no hair, no physical evidence of what had been there. That was the last time I went camping in those woods. Bobby kept going back, sometimes with other friends, sometimes alone. He never encountered the monkey beast again, even when camping at our old spot. 20 years have passed since that night. Bobby died in 2017, heart attack at 44. Too many cigarettes, the doctors said. At his funeral, I thought about telling his wife about our experiences in the woods, but what would be the point? We never had proof, just stories about something that screamed in the night. Sometimes I drive out to the edge of those woods and look in. I wonder if it's still in there, whatever it was. I wonder if it recognized us when we came back as adults. I wonder why it only appeared when it was just the two of us, never when we brought others along. But mostly, I wonder if it's waiting for someone else to camp between those two old oaks, to sit by a fire as the midnight hour approaches, waiting to circle in the darkness, to announce its presence with screams and destruction before vanishing back into the swamps of Kalamazoo County, leaving nothing behind but broken trees and questions no one can answer. Story 14. I shouldn't have gone back to the cabin alone. That's what I keep telling myself now. 20 years of hunting trips up there with my dad and brothers, and 5 years going solo after they all moved away. And I never once felt unsafe in those woods. Until 2018. The drive from Billings to our family property near Whitefish took just over 6 hours. It was late September, early elk season, and I was looking forward to a week alone in the mountains. No cell service, no internet. Just me, my rifle, and the woods that had been in the Blackwood family for 3 generations. I turned off the highway onto the dirt road leading to our land around 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was already getting low behind the mountains, and the shadows stretched long across the road. My truck bounced over the ruts and potholes as I made my way deeper into the forest. The road narrowed, pine branches scraping against my windows as I pushed forward. When I rounded the final bend and our cabin came into view, I immediately knew something was wrong. The front door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I parked and grabbed my 30-06 from its case, loading it before stepping out of the truck. "Hello?" I called out, approaching slowly. "Anybody here?" No answer, just the wind in the pines. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it fully open with the barrel of my rifle. The sight inside froze me in place. It looked like a tornado had torn through the small space. The table was flipped, chairs broken into pieces. The cabinet doors hung open, our supplies scattered across the floor, cans of food dented and thrown about. The mattress from the bed frame was ripped apart, stuffing spread everywhere. The smell hit me next. A powerful stench like wet dog mixed with rotting meat that made my eyes water. I pulled my shirt collar up over my nose, breathing through my mouth as I stepped inside. "What the hell happened here?" I muttered, surveying the damage. In the far corner of the cabin, something caught my eye. A structure made of broken branches, pine needles, and what looked like animal hide had been assembled. It reminded me of a crude nest, about 4 feet in diameter. I approached it carefully, poking at it with my boot. The material was packed tight, and several deer hides were woven into the structure. My first thought was bears. We'd had problems with them before, breaking in for food, making a mess. But this was different. Bears don't build nests, and they don't typically destroy things this methodically. I stepped back outside, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the footprints in the soft earth outside the cabin door. Huge, human-like impressions that dwarfed my size 11 boots. I placed my foot next to one for comparison. It was easily twice the size, with 5 distinct toe marks pressed deep into the dirt. The stride length between prints was massive, at least 4 feet apart. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the dense forest to the north. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether to get back in my truck and leave, but daylight was fading, and I had nowhere else to go. The nearest town was 45 minutes back, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Whatever had been here was gone now, I told myself, probably just some homeless person or drug addict who'd broken in and trashed the place. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the footprints, or the nest, or the overwhelming feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning up. I righted the furniture that could be saved, swept up broken glass, and gathered the scattered supplies. I found my sleeping bag in the truck and laid it out on the bare bed frame, since the mattress was destroyed. By the time darkness fell, I'd made the place somewhat habitable again. I locked the door, though the frame was damaged and it didn't close properly, and sat at the table cleaning my rifle by lamplight. The familiar routine calmed my nerves slightly, but every creak and groan of the cabin set me on edge. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the pines and making the walls shudder. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay on the hard bed frame in my sleeping bag, rifle at my side, staring at the ceiling. Every time I drifted off, a sound would jerk me awake. A branch scraping against the roof, an animal moving in the underbrush outside, the soft hooting of an owl. Each time I'd grip my rifle tighter, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Around 3 a.m., I heard something heavy moving outside, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up, rifle ready, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps paused outside my window, and I could feel eyes on me through the glass. I didn't dare move to look. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but alive. The early light revealed nothing unusual outside the cabin, no new footprints, no signs of disturbance. I chalked up the night's terrors to my imagination and the wind. I made coffee on the camp stove and ate a cold breakfast of jerky and an energy bar. I needed meat if I was going to stay the week, so I decided to hunt, despite my sleepless night. I gathered my gear, locked the cabin as best I could, and headed into the forest. The familiar routine of tracking settled my nerves. I moved quietly through the trees, following game trails I'd known since childhood. By mid-morning, I'd spotted a decent-sized buck about 80 yards away, grazing in a small clearing. I raised my rifle, steadied my breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the trees. The buck jumped, ran 10 yards, then collapsed. A clean kill. I approached the animal, said the silent thanks my father had taught me, and set about field dressing it. The work was messy, but familiar, my hands moving automatically through the process. It took me about an hour to get the deer ready to transport. I hoisted it onto my shoulders and began the trek back to the cabin, planning to hang the meat to cool before processing it further. The sight that greeted me as I emerged from the trees stopped me cold. My cabin, or what remained of it, was completely destroyed. The front wall had collapsed inward. The door had been ripped completely off its hinges and lay 20 feet away in the dirt. The roof sagged dangerously. Half of it caved in. All my supplies, everything I'd spent hours organizing the night before, were scattered across the clearing. I dropped the deer carcass and approached slowly, rifle ready. The destruction was even worse up close. Whatever had done this had incredible strength. Solid wooden support beams were snapped like twigs. The metal stove had been yanked from its chimney pipe and thrown outside. My sleeping bag was shredded into ribbons. But the most disturbing sight waited for me on the edge of the clearing. A large pine tree, about 30 feet high, stood at the forest's edge. Hanging from one of its branches, at least 10 feet off the ground, was a fresh deer carcass. Not my buck. This was a different animal. It had been gutted, its insides hanging down the trunk of the tree, blood and viscera staining the bark. My hands began to shake. No human could have lifted a full deer carcass that high without equipment, and no bear hunts like that. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree line, scanning for movement. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees about 50 yards from where I stood. Then it stepped partially into the light. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with a broad, powerful build. It stood upright on 2 legs. Dark, matted fur covered its body. Its shoulders were enormous, tapering to a more narrow waist, but it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. Deeply set beneath a heavy brow, they watched me with unmistakable intelligence. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. Those eyes understood. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were sending a message. Our gazes locked for 5, maybe 10 seconds. Then the creature deliberately raised one massive hand and placed it against a tree trunk, as if marking its territory. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and sprinted for my truck, fumbling with the keys as I reached it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, tires spitting dirt as I backed around. I didn't even close the door properly until I was already moving. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The creature had moved to the edge of the clearing and stood watching my retreat. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. I drove straight back to Billings without stopping. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. By the time I reached cell service again, it was late afternoon. I pulled over and called my buddy Jack Riley, who lived in Kalispell, about an hour from our property. "You're not going to believe what happened," I told him, my voice still unsteady. "Try me," he said. I recounted everything, the destroyed cabin, the footprints, the deer in the tree, and finally, the creature I'd seen. There was a long pause before Jack responded. "You're saying you saw a Sasquatch?" "I don't know what I saw," I replied honestly, "but it wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear." Jack agreed to drive out to the property the next day to check things out. I told him to be careful, to go during daylight and not to go alone. I spent that night in a motel off the highway, jumping at every sound. I barely slept. Images of those intelligent eyes haunting me whenever I closed my own. Jack called me the following evening. "Tom, "I went out there with my cousin Mike," he said, his voice tight. "The cabin's just like you described, totally demolished." "Did you see anything?" I asked. "No, but—" He paused. "We found fresh footprints, same as what you described, huge, human-like. And they were new, Tom, made since the last rainfall, which was this morning." My stomach dropped. "It's still there. Seems like it. And something else. We found more of those nests. 3 of them, in the woods surrounding your property, made of branches and animal skins, just like you said. I listed the cabin with a real estate agent the following week. Sold the property for less than market value to a developer from Seattle who never asked questions about the storm damage mentioned in the listing. Some people don't believe me when I tell this story. They think I saw a bear, or maybe even another hunter playing a sick joke. But I know what I saw in those woods. I've been a hunter all my life. I know the difference between animal behavior and something more deliberate. That creature didn't just wreck my cabin because it was looking for food. It systematically destroyed my shelter. It hung that deer as a warning. It watched me flee and let me go. It was marking its territory, and I was the intruder. I've never gone back to those woods, and I never will. Some places belong to something else, something that was there long before us and will be there long after. Something that doesn't want to share. Sometimes at night, I still see those eyes watching me from the forest edge, calculating, intelligent, and unmistakably angry. Story 15. The 5-day backpacking trip into Washington's Cascade Mountains was supposed to be our summer adventure. Just me, Megan Carter, and my 3 best friends from high school. We had been planning it for months, mapping routes that would take us far from the regular trails where weekend hikers and families ventured. Amy had inherited her dad's old topographical maps, and Kelly knew the mountains better than any of us, having grown up in a small town at their base. Jess was our wilderness expert, the one who'd taken every survival course offered in the Tri-County area. We were no amateurs. Between us, we had decades of hiking experience. That's what makes this so hard to explain. Even now, day 1 and 2 went exactly as planned. We hiked 8 miles each day, set up camp in gorgeous spots, cooked our dehydrated meals on portable stoves, and slept under more stars than you'd believe existed. The weather held perfect. Warm days, cool nights, not a cloud in sight. It was the 3rd day when things changed. We'd gone completely off-trail by then, pushing through dense undergrowth and following nothing but Kelly's compass and Amy's wrinkled maps. I remember feeling almost giddy with how remote we were, how far from cell service or help. There's a certain pride in knowing you're truly on your own. "Here," Kelly announced around 4 in the afternoon, pointing to a small clearing nestled between towering pines. "This is perfect." The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with soft ground covered in pine needles. A fallen log stretched across one side, making a natural bench. I dropped my 50-pound pack with a relieved grunt and stretched my arms toward the sky. "Home, sweet home," Jess said, already unpacking her tent. We set up camp efficiently, the way we always did. 2 tents facing each other across what would be our fire pit, our packs stacked neatly between the tents. Food hung in the trees away from camp to avoid attracting bears. As darkness fell, Amy got the fire going. We sat around it on the log and some flat rocks, passing a small flask of whiskey back and forth. The flames pushed back the darkness in a 20-foot circle. Beyond that was absolute blackness. "Cheers to us," Kelly said, raising the flask. 3 days in, and no emergencies." We all laughed and took turns sipping. I remember looking up at the stars, thinking how impossibly clear they were, when Amy stopped mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We fell silent. At first I heard nothing but the crackle of our fire. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, came the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Not small like a raccoon or fox, Something big, something heavy. "Probably a deer," Jess said, but her voice had that tight quality it gets when she's nervous. Then the smell hit us. It rolled over our camp like a physical wave, powerful, nauseating, like rotten meat mixed with something musky and sharp. I gagged and covered my mouth. Kelly actually bent over, hands on her knees. "Jesus Christ," Amy choked out. "What is that?" As suddenly as it had come, the smell vanished. The rustling stopped too. We sat frozen, straining our ears, but heard nothing. "Let's get in the tents," Kelly suggested, her voice unnaturally high. "It's getting late anyway." No one argued. We kicked dirt over the fire until it was just embers and crawled into our tents. I shared with Kelly, while Amy and Jess took the other. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening. For a long time there was nothing. Sleep eventually came, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of being watched. The morning broke clear and bright. In the daylight, with birds singing overhead, the fear from the night before seemed almost silly. Almost. "Let's check around the camp," Jess suggested after breakfast. "See if we can figure out what was out there." We spread out, searching the perimeter of our clearing. I was the one who found them, massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth at the edge of the trees. They circled our entire camp. "Guys," I called, my voice cracking, "you need to see this." They gathered around, crouching to examine what I'd found. The prints were huge, at least 16 inches long, with clear toe impressions, 5 toes, almost human but not quite. Too big, too wide. "Bear," Amy said immediately, but there was no conviction in her voice. Kelly shook her head. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs in a perfect circle around a camp." We all knew what she meant. Whatever had made these tracks had been methodically surveying our camp, walking its perimeter, watching us. "We should head back," I said, voicing what I assumed we were all thinking. But Jess shook her head. "We're already 3 days in. It would take us just as long to go back as to complete the route. Besides," she added, forcing a smile, "it was probably just curious. If it wanted to hurt us, it would have." That logic, flawed as it seems to me now, won the day. We broke camp and continued deeper into the woods, following our original route. No one mentioned the footprints again, but we were all quieter than usual, constantly scanning the trees around us. That night, we found another clearing, smaller than the first. We set up camp quickly, wanting to finish before dark. No one suggested sitting outside by the fire. Instead, we ate our dinner huddled in a tight circle, speaking in low voices. "We'll take watches tonight," Kelly suggested. 2 hours each. No one questioned why. We all knew. I took the first watch, sitting with my back against a tree, a large hunting knife that belonged to Jess clutched in my hand. The others retreated to the tents, but I doubt they slept. An hour into my watch, it started again. The sound of heavy footsteps moving around our camp, just beyond the reach of our firelight, snapping twigs, the rustle of leaves. And something else, breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing. I should have called out, woken the others. Instead, I sat paralyzed, the knife trembling in my grip. The sounds continued, circling our camp just as the footprints had. Then came the smell again, that putrid, musky odor that caught in the back of my throat. When Kelly emerged to take her watch, I practically dove into the tent. The 4 of us huddled there, wide awake, listening to whatever it was circle our camp for hours. No one spoke. We just clutched our makeshift weapons, Jess's knife, Amy's heavy flashlight, the small canister of bear spray Kelly always carried, and waited for dawn. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first grey light filtered through the trees, the sounds finally stopped. We emerged from our tents, haggard and exhausted. "We're going back," Kelly announced. No one argued this time. We packed up in record time, leaving by 7 a.m. The return route would take us 2 days if we pushed hard, which we intended to do. Our plan was to hike until late afternoon, camp near the main trail where other hikers might pass, then make the final push to the car tomorrow. We had gone maybe 3 miles when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced at the others and knew they felt it too. Something was following us. "Keep moving," Jess whispered. "Don't look back." We quickened our pace, pushing through the forest as fast as our tired legs would carry us. Every so often, we'd stop to catch our breath. When we stopped, the forest behind us went completely silent. When we started moving again, we'd hear it. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, always just out of sight. By late afternoon, we were near the main trail. The familiar boot-trodden path was the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. We set up our final camp just off the trail, hoping the proximity to civilization would keep our stalker at bay. That night, we built the biggest fire we could manage and sat around it in silence, too exhausted and frightened to talk. Despite our plan to keep watch, we eventually all retreated to our tents, the day's hard hike having taken its toll. I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. It was around midnight when something woke me. A noise outside, different from the forest sounds I'd grown accustomed to. It was a sort of huffing, followed by the distinct sound of our packs being moved. Heart pounding, I nudged Kelly awake and put a finger to my lips. I unzipped our tent just enough to peek out. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Hunched over our packs was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood at least 7 feet tall, even in its stooped position. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, but it was the arms that made my breath catch, unnaturally long, extending almost to the ground, ending in massive hands, with fingers that seemed too dexterous as they explored the contents of Amy's pack. I must have made some sound, because the creature suddenly went still. Then slowly, it turned its head toward our tent. Its face was the most human-like thing about it, a flat nose, deep-set eyes that caught the firelight, a heavy brow. For one terrible moment, those eyes locked with mine. I reached blindly for the emergency flare I kept in my tent pocket. My fingers closed around it as the creature took a step toward us. With shaking hands, I lit the flare. The sudden burst of red light seemed to startle the creature. It recoiled, raising those long arms to shield its eyes. A deep, guttural grunt escaped it, not quite animal, not quite human. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. "What the hell was that?" Kelly hissed, now fully awake and wide-eyed. Before I could answer, Amy and Jess were scrambling out of their tent, having been awakened by the flare. "It was going through our packs," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know what it was. But we all knew. None of us would say it out loud, but we knew what we'd been dealing with these past 3 days. A creature that wasn't supposed to exist outside of campfire stories and blurry photographs. We didn't sleep after that. We kept the fire blazing all night, sitting in a tight circle around it, weapons in hand. No one spoke much. What was there to say? As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up and practically ran the remaining 4 miles to our car. We threw our packs in the trunk and piled in, Kelly gunning the engine before all the doors were even closed. As we sped away from the trailhead, I looked back at the forest one last time. The dense wall of trees revealed nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching us leave. During the 3-hour drive back to town, no one mentioned what had happened. No one suggested reporting it to the rangers or calling the local newspaper. There was an unspoken agreement between us. What we had seen would stay with us. It's been 5 years since that trip. We're all still friends, but we don't go hiking together anymore. Sometimes, when we're together, one of us will get a certain look, and I know they're thinking about it too. About the footprints, the breathing in the dark. The creature hunched over our packs. I've researched it since then, of course. Read accounts of other sightings in the Cascades. Learned about the long history of encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I know what people call it, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. But names don't matter. What matters is that it's out there, and for 3 terrifying nights in the summer of 2018, it watched us, stalked us, studied us. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through those remote forests. And sometimes, on nights when the wind makes strange sounds against my bedroom window, I wonder if it remembers us too.